On July 27, 1656, the elders of Amsterdam's Portuguese Jewish congregation pronounced a curse unlike any other in their records. Baruch Spinoza, 23 years old, was to be cut off from his people completely. No one could speak to him, shelter him, read his writings, or approach within 4 cubits of his presence. The writ wished divine wrath upon his every moment. Cursed be he by day, and cursed be he by night. Cursed be he when he lies down, and cursed be he when he rises up. His crime was identifying God with nature itself. This wasn't the atheism his accusers claimed. Spinoza argued that God exists necessarily, eternally, infinitely, but not as a supernatural being standing outside the natural world, intervening through miracles and answering prayers. God is the natural world, expressing divine essence through the same immutable laws that govern falling stones and orbiting planets, human emotions, and mathematical truths. To say God is to say nature, Deus, sive, natura, one reality, comprehended under different aspects. The scandal wasn't denying God, but eliminating the gap between sacred and secular that every established religion requires. If God and nature are identical, then natural laws are divine will. Scientific understanding is religious devotion, and human beings aren't kingdoms within kingdoms, but modes of the single, infinite substance. Miracles become impossible, not because God lacks power, but because God cannot violate the eternal laws that constitute divine nature. Prayer cannot change outcomes determined by necessity. The Bible becomes a human document reflecting its historical moment, rather than timeless revelation. Every assumption underlying traditional religion collapses once God and nature are identified. Born to Portuguese refugees who fled the Inquisition, Spinoza lived in the Dutch Republic's relative tolerance whilst supporting himself grinding optical lenses, a craft that became metaphor for his philosophical method. Polishing glass reveals its true optical properties by removing imperfections. Spinoza's philosophy polishes away superstition, anthropomorphic projections, and confused ideas to reveal reality's underlying structure. His masterwork, The Ethics, proceeds in geometrical order, with definitions, axioms, propositions, and proofs building toward conclusions as rigorous as mathematical theorems. The system that emerges from this method addresses the deepest human yearnings whilst demanding complete intellectual honesty. Meaning arises not from supernatural purpose but from understanding our place within nature's eternal patterns. Freedom emerges not by escaping necessity but by comprehending the causes that determine us, transforming passive reaction into active understanding. The sacred reveals itself not through miracles but through what Spinoza calls the intellectual love of God. The joy that arises from grasping eternal truths, recognizing ourselves as temporary expressions of infinite creative power. The free man thinks least of all of death, Spinoza wrote, and his wisdom is a meditation, not on death, but on life. This 17th century lens grinder developed the most systematic alternative to both religious orthodoxy and materialistic despair, a path to blessedness through reason that remains as revolutionary now as when it first earned him excommunication. Part 1. The Revolutionary Foundation. Baruch Spinoza made an audacious decision that would revolutionize philosophy forever. He would apply Euclid's geometric method to the deepest questions of existence itself. His masterwork, The Ethics, unfolds in geometrical order with definitions, axioms, propositions, and rigorous proofs, as if the nature of God, mind, and human flourishing could be demonstrated with the same certainty as the angles of a triangle. This wasn't mere academic exercise or philosophical showmanship. Spinoza held the radical conviction that philosophical truth should be as certain and systematic as mathematical truth, grounded in reason rather than revelation, tradition, or the shifting sands of human opinion. The order and connection of ideas is the same as the order and connection of things, Spinoza declared, establishing that reality itself possesses a logical structure we can discover through rigorous reasoning. If the universe operates according to rational principles, then philosophy must adopt the methods that reveal those principles most clearly. The geometric method becomes not just a tool but a mirror of reality's own rational architecture. This approach immediately confronted the fundamental problem that had plagued traditional philosophy for centuries: the assumption of multiple separate substances. Medieval and early modern thinkers had constructed reality from distinct building blocks: God as supernatural creator, standing outside nature; individual minds as thinking substances somehow separate from physical reality; and material bodies as extended substances operating according to mechanical laws. Each substance supposedly existed independently, following its own nature whilst mysteriously interacting with the others. This framework created the notorious interaction problem that tormented philosophers like Descartes. If mind and body are completely different kinds of substance, one thinking and unextended, the other extended but incapable of thought, how can they possibly influence each other? How does a mental decision to raise your arm actually cause physical movement? Descartes' desperate attempt to locate this mysterious interaction in the pineal gland only highlighted the theory's fundamental inadequacy. A tiny gland cannot bridge the absolute gulf between two entirely different kinds of reality. Spinoza recognized that these problems weren't mere technical difficulties to be solved with clever explanations. They revealed something fundamentally wrong with the entire framework of multiple substances. His geometric method would expose these assumptions to logical scrutiny and reveal their impossibility. The revolution begins with definition 3. By substance, 1. Mean that which is in itself and is conceived through itself, something that requires nothing else for its existence or understanding, like a geometric axiom that needs no external proof or support. This seemingly technical definition contains explosive implications that will detonate beneath centuries of philosophical orthodoxy. If substance must be completely self-sufficient, then it cannot depend on anything else for its existence, properties, or intelligibility. It must contain within itself everything necessary for its being and comprehension. Consider what this means. A true substance cannot be created by something else, for then it would depend on its creator. It cannot be limited by external boundaries, for then it would depend on what lies beyond those boundaries. It cannot even be understood by reference to anything outside itself, for then our knowledge of it would depend on something other than the substance itself. This definition leads inexorably to proposition 5. There cannot be two or more substances of the same nature or attribute. Spinoza's reasoning follows with geometric precision. If two substances existed with the same essential nature, they would be indistinguishable in their fundamental character. But then what could possibly differentiate them? They would have to differ in some accidental property or external relation. Yet any such difference would make them dependent on that difference rather than truly self-sufficient. They would fail to meet the very definition of substance. The logic becomes inescapable. Through the relentless logic of his geometric method, Spinoza arrives at the most revolutionary conclusion in the history of philosophy. Proposition 14 of the Ethics delivers the decisive blow. Besides God, no substance can be or be conceived. The careful architecture of definitions and demonstrations has eliminated every candidate for substantial existence except one: There cannot be two infinite substances, for they would limit each other and thus cease to be infinite. There cannot be finite substances, for they would require external causation and thus fail to be self-caused. Only one substance remains, and this substance must be both God and nature. But Spinoza goes further than merely proving God's existence. He identifies God completely with nature itself, coining the phrase that would make him the most dangerous philosopher in Europe: Deus sive natura, God or nature. This is not metaphor or approximation. Spinoza means that God and nature are two names for the same reality, like morning star and evening star, referring to Venus. The scandal was immediate and absolute. To his contemporaries, Spinoza had committed the ultimate blasphemy. He had eliminated the supernatural God who creates and governs from outside nature, replacing divine transcendence with divine immanence so complete that it erased the distinction altogether. Consider what this identity means for our understanding of divine activity. God is not a supernatural being who stands outside the natural world, occasionally intervening through miracles or providence. Rather, God is the eternal, infinite, necessary existence of nature itself, expressing itself through unchanging laws. God acts solely by the laws of his own nature and is not constrained by anyone. Spinoza declares, every natural event, from the elliptical orbit of planets to the surge of human emotions, becomes a direct expression of divine activity rather than the result of divine commands imposed on passive matter. The laws of physics are not God's arbitrary decrees but the necessary expression of God's own nature. This transforms our understanding of individual existence entirely. Everything that exists, every stone, tree, animal, human being, thought, and emotion, is a mode or modification of this single God-nature substance. Spinoza's favorite analogy illuminates this relationship. Individual things relate to God. Nature, as geometric figures, relate to infinite extension. A triangle drawn in sand is not separate from extension itself, but a particular, temporary modification of it. Similarly, you and one are not separate beings who happen to exist in God's creation, but finite modifications of God's infinite being, temporary patterns in the eternal substance. This doctrine eliminates the traditional problem that had plagued theology for centuries. How can finite beings relate to an infinite God? The question dissolves because there are no separate beings. There is only one being expressing itself in infinite ways. Your existence is not contingent upon God's decision to create you. It is a necessary expression of God's infinite creativity, as inevitable as mathematical truths. Yet this creates an apparent paradox that Spinoza's critics seized upon immediately. If everything is God, why does the world contain imperfection, suffering, and evil? How can divine perfection accommodate finite limitation? Spinoza's response reveals the depth of his naturalistic theology. He distinguishes between God's infinite nature, which is absolutely perfect, and finite modes, which are necessarily limited by their very finitude. The perfection of things is to be reckoned only from their own nature and power. Things are not more or less perfect, accordingly as they delight or offend human senses. A stone is perfect as a stone, expressing its nature completely within the constraints of its finite existence. It is not an imperfect attempt at being a tree or a human being. Similarly, human suffering and limitation are not flaws in God's creation, but necessary expressions of finite existence within infinite nature. To judge them as imperfections is to impose human preferences upon the eternal perspective of God nature itself. This naturalistic theology eliminates anthropomorphic projections whilst preserving genuine reverence for existence itself. The most revolutionary doctrine in all of Spinoza's philosophy appears in Proposition 29 of the Ethics. Nothing in nature is contingent, but all things are determined by the necessity of divine nature to exist and operate in a certain way. This single statement demolishes the entire edifice of traditional metaphysics, which had always reserved space for the possible, the accidental, the contingent. For Spinoza, such categories represent nothing more than the shadows cast by human ignorance. The logic flows inexorably from God-nature's perfect rationality. If the divine substance operates according to eternal laws rather than arbitrary will, then everything that follows from those laws must follow necessarily. There can be no gaps, no moments where reality might have turned out differently, no alternative possibilities lurking in the wings. The universe unfolds with the same logical necessity as a geometric proof, each stage determined completely by what preceded it, according to immutable natural laws. What we call contingency, what we experience as the realm of the possible or accidental, reflects only our incomplete grasp of the causal chains that make events inevitable. When we say something might happen, or could have been otherwise, we reveal not genuine openness in nature, but the limitations of our own understanding. With perfect knowledge, we would see that everything that exists must exist exactly as it does, and everything that happens must happen exactly as it does, flowing necessarily from the eternal structure of reality itself. This strikes at the heart of human self-understanding. As Spinoza observes with characteristic precision, men believe themselves free simply because they are conscious of their actions and unconscious of the causes whereby those actions are determined. We feel free because we experience our desires and choices from within, whilst remaining ignorant of the vast network of causes that shaped those very desires and made those choices inevitable. The sensation of freedom emerges from a kind of cognitive blindness to our own causal embeddedness in nature. Yet Spinoza's conception of necessity operates alongside an equally radical understanding of eternity. God-nature is eternal, not in the sense of lasting forever in time, but in the sense of existing outside temporal succession altogether. Eternity represents the logical structure within which all temporal events unfold, the timeless framework that gives temporal change its meaning and direction. As Spinoza insists, eternity cannot be explained in terms of time or have any relation to time. Mathematical truths provide the clearest analogy. The Pythagorean theorem doesn't exist in time, waiting to be discovered or created. It represents an eternal relationship that temporal measurements can exemplify but never exhaust. Similarly, the laws governing nature's operations exist eternally, not as temporal precedents that cause later effects, but as the logical structure that makes temporal causation intelligible. Every particular event participates in this eternal order whilst remaining thoroughly temporal in its concrete existence. This doctrine appears to lead directly to fatalism. If everything is necessary, if human actions follow as inevitably from prior causes as geometric conclusions from their premises, does human effort become meaningless? The question haunts anyone who grasps the full implications of Spinoza's metaphysics. Yet this apparent fatalism conceals a deeper liberation that emerges only through proper understanding of what human beings actually are as natural phenomena. The resolution lies not in escaping natural causation, but in understanding and aligning ourselves with it. We become free not by stepping outside the causal order, but by becoming active rather than passive expressions of nature's creativity. Understanding necessity actually increases rather than eliminates human power. transforming us from victims of forces we cannot comprehend into conscious participants in the eternal processes that constitute reality itself. The path to genuine freedom begins with accepting the complete necessity of everything that is. Part 2. The nature of mind. Descartes bequeathed to philosophy a problem that seemed intractable. If mind is immaterial thinking substance and body is material extended substance, how can they possibly interact? This notorious mind-body problem plagued Cartesian philosophy from its inception. Descartes himself recognized the difficulty, desperately hypothesizing that interaction occurs in the pineal gland, a tiny structure in the brain where, somehow, the immaterial soul could influence material processes. Critics ridiculed this solution mercilessly, asking the obvious question: how could an immaterial soul move a material gland? If the soul lacks extension, it cannot push or pull anything physical. The problem reflects a deeper error in Cartesian metaphysics, treating mind and body as separate substances that must somehow communicate across an ontological gulf that, by definition, cannot be bridged. Spinoza dissolved this problem with elegant simplicity through Proposition 7 of the Ethics. This isn't merely a claim about correspondence between mental and physical events. It's a revolutionary reconception of their relationship. Mind and body aren't two different substances trying to interact across an impossible divide. They are two attributes or aspects of the same individual reality, like two sides of a single coin. The coin's heads and tails don't cause each other. They are different aspects of one thing. Similarly, every physical event has a corresponding mental event, and every mental event corresponds to a physical event, but they don't cause each other because they are the same event described in two different ways. This insight transforms our understanding of human nature through Proposition 13. The human mind is literally the idea of the human body. Not something separate that controls or inhabits the body, but the mental aspect of the same natural reality that has the body as its physical aspect. As Spinoza puts it with characteristic precision, the mind and the body are one and the same thing, conceived now under the attribute of thought, now under the attribute of extension. This makes the mind-body unity as intimate as possible whilst preserving the distinctiveness of mental and physical descriptions. We are not ghosts in machines, nor machines pretending to be conscious, but unified, natural beings whose mental and physical aspects are two ways of describing the same reality. This doctrine invites misunderstanding, so we must be clear about what Spinoza is and isn't claiming. This isn't reductive materialism that eliminates mind in favor of brain states, nor idealism that dissolves body into mental phenomena. It's a dual-aspect theory that takes both mental and physical reality seriously as different ways of describing the same natural processes. The solution preserves everything we want to preserve about mental life: consciousness, reasoning, emotions, creativity, the felt experience of deliberation and choice, whilst locating them firmly within the natural order rather than in a supernatural realm. We remain thinking, feeling, choosing beings. This naturalistic understanding of mind opens new possibilities for understanding human knowledge, emotion, and development that traditional dualism made impossible to conceive. Human beings suffer primarily because they misunderstand the nature of their own experience. Spinoza recognized that most of our mental life operates through what he called imagination, the first and lowest kind of knowledge, where we encounter effects without grasping their causes. We experience pleasure and pain, success and failure, love and hatred, but remain ignorant of the natural forces that produce these states within us. This ignorance breeds confusion, and from confusion comes the elaborate mythology we construct about our lives. When we don't understand why we feel anxious on certain mornings, why we're drawn to particular people, or why our plans succeed or fail, we create stories about luck, fate, divine intervention, or personal inadequacy. We imagine ourselves as separate agents, buffeted by external forces beyond our comprehension. Spinoza observed that men are deceived in that they think themselves free. This opinion is based on the fact that they are conscious of their volitions and desires, but are ignorant of the causes which dispose them to will and desire. We know what we want, but not why we want it, and this partial knowledge generates the illusion of arbitrary freedom, whilst actually keeping us in bondage to forces we don't recognize. Imagination operates through fragments and associations. We see the sun as a small disk moving across the sky because that's how it appears to our senses. We fear certain outcomes because they've caused pain before, without understanding the specific conditions that made those outcomes painful. We develop preferences and aversions based on confused connections between experiences. This fragmented knowledge leaves us reactive rather than active, responding to apparent threats and opportunities without comprehending the underlying patterns that govern our responses. The mind naturally progresses beyond imagination toward rational knowledge, the second kind of knowledge that grasps eternal laws and common properties governing natural phenomena. Through reason, we discover that the sun is vastly larger than Earth, and that its apparent motion results from our planet's rotation. We understand that our fears and desires follow natural patterns that can be studied and comprehended. We recognize that what seemed arbitrary and contingent actually follows necessary laws. Spinoza developed this insight systematically in Proposition 40, Scholium 2, showing how the mind moves from confused particular impressions toward universal principles that explain why things must be as they are. His own geometric method exemplifies this progression. We begin with specific observations about triangles or circles, then discover the eternal mathematical relationships that govern all geometric figures. These universal principles don't exist separately from particular triangles. Rather, they are the eternal patterns that particular triangles express in their specific configurations. Rational knowledge liberates us from the constant fluctuations of imagination by revealing stable patterns underlying apparent chaos. When we understand the natural causes of our emotional states, we're no longer at their mercy. We recognize that what felt like personal failure might result from circumstances beyond our control, whilst what seemed like personal success might depend on factors we didn't create. This understanding doesn't eliminate emotions, but transforms them from confused reactions into responses based on adequate comprehension. Each level of knowledge represents increased mental activity rather than passivity. Imagination is largely passive. We receive impressions and react to them without understanding their origins. Reason actively organizes experience according to universal principles, allowing us to anticipate patterns and work skillfully with natural forces. The mind's power increases as its knowledge becomes more adequate to reality. This progression reveals something profound about human nature itself. Spinoza noted that the more we understand particular things, the more do we understand God, meaning that deeper comprehension of natural patterns brings us closer to grasping the eternal principles that govern all existence. Understanding natural causes increases our power by allowing us to work with causal forces rather than being blindly driven by them. Spinoza's theory of error revolutionizes our understanding of how the human mind relates to truth and falsehood. In Proposition 35 of the Ethics, he declares that falsity consists in the privation of knowledge. Error is not a positive faculty of the mind, but rather the absence of adequate knowledge, like darkness as the absence of light. This insight eliminates one of the most troubling problems in traditional philosophy. How could a good God create minds capable of error? Spinoza's answer is elegant and profound. Error isn't something created at all. It's simply the natural limitation of finite minds that cannot grasp infinite truth all at once. Error, for Spinoza, is nothing positive, but rather incomplete or confused understanding that can be corrected through more adequate ideas. When we make mistakes, we're not exercising some special faculty for falsehood. We're simply thinking with insufficient information or unclear concepts. The mind naturally moves toward truth when it encounters more complete understanding, just as shadows naturally disappear when light increases. This means that error is self-correcting. It contains within itself the seeds of its own dissolution. The implications become even more striking in Proposition 43. Truth is its own standard. Adequate ideas carry their own evidence and naturally drive out inadequate ones when the mind is free to think clearly. Truth is self-authenticating rather than requiring external validation. When we truly understand something, we recognize that understanding immediately, without needing additional proof. Consider mathematical insight. When we grasp why the angles of a triangle equal 180 degrees, we don't need external authority to confirm this knowledge. The understanding carries its own certainty. This makes genuine knowledge intrinsically liberating rather than dependent on social consensus or traditional authority. The human mind has a natural tendency toward truth and understanding because it is itself part of God nature's infinite intellect, expressing the same rational structure that governs physical reality. As Spinoza puts it, the human mind is part of the infinite intellect of God. Our capacity for knowledge isn't accidental, but reflects our essential nature as thinking beings. This is why Spinoza observes that no one can desire to be blessed, to act rightly, and to live rightly, without simultaneously wishing to be, to act, and to live, that is, to actually exist. The drive toward truth is inseparable from the drive toward fuller existence. Mental freedom consists not in arbitrary choice, but in the mind's natural movement, from confused to adequate ideas, from passive reaction to active understanding of its place in the eternal order. This process is simultaneously intellectual and therapeutic. Understanding the causes of our confusion reduces its power over us, whilst opening possibilities for more rational responses to life's challenges. When we understand why we feel jealous or angry, those emotions lose their compulsive force and become opportunities for clearer thinking about our actual situation. This naturalistic understanding of mind leads directly to a revolutionary psychology of emotions based on the fundamental striving that defines all natural beings, including human beings. Part 3. The architecture of human nature. Every individual thing in nature possesses what Spinoza called Conatus, the fundamental striving to persevere in its being. This is not a drive that things happen to have, but the very essence of what makes them the particular things they are rather than nothing at all. As Spinoza declares in Proposition 6 of the Ethics, each thing, insofar as it is in itself, endeavors to persevere in its being. The stone maintains its structure against erosion. The plant grows toward light. The animal seeks nourishment, each according to its nature, each expressing the basic principle that to exist is to strive. This striving operates through natural necessity, not conscious choice. The conatus of a thing is simply what that thing is when viewed dynamically rather than statically. Spinoza makes this identity explicit. The striving by which each thing endeavors to persevere in its being is nothing but the actual essence of the thing. We are not beings who happen to strive. We are striving itself, temporarily organized into the complex patterns we call human life. This revolutionary insight eliminates the traditional philosophical problem of explaining why things act at all. Action is not something added to existence, but existence itself understood properly. In human beings, Conatus manifests simultaneously as bodily appetite and mental desire. Appetite is the physical striving for what enhances the body's power. Food when hungry, rest when tired, movement when restless. Desire is this same striving accompanied by consciousness of itself. As Spinoza defines it, desire is appetite with consciousness of the appetite, even. Ipse then, anemen. This consciousness does not create desire but reveals it, making us aware of the fundamental striving that constitutes our being. Desire emerges as the primary human emotion from which all others derive their meaning and force. This naturalistic understanding transforms our relationship to desire itself. Traditional morality condemns desire as dangerous or evil, something to be suppressed or transcended. Spinoza recognizes desire as neither good nor evil, but simply the basic fact of human existence. We are desiring beings because we are living beings, and living means striving to enhance our reality and power. To condemn desire is to condemn existence itself, a position that reveals its own incoherence. The moment we recognize that even the desire to suppress desire is itself a desire. Yet Conatus extends far beyond mere self-preservation. We do not simply seek to avoid death, but actively pursue greater reality, complexity, and power. Spinoza's insight that by reality and perfection one mean the same thing reveals that our fundamental striving aims toward flourishing rather than mere survival. The plant does not just maintain its current state, but grows, develops, produces fruit, and reproduces. Human beings similarly seek to expand their capacities for thinking, creating, relating, and understanding. We are naturally drawn toward whatever increases our power of acting and thinking, because such increase represents greater reality, greater perfection in Spinoza's technical sense. This striving is neither selfish nor altruistic in conventional terms, but simply natural. Like the plant growing toward light, we naturally move toward what genuinely enhances our being. Properly understood, this often requires cooperation, learning, and care for others, because human flourishing depends essentially on social relationships and environmental conditions. The hermit who withdraws from society diminishes rather than enhances his power, because human nature itself is fundamentally social and rational. The implications prove profound. If Conatus constitutes our essence, then understanding what truly enhances our power becomes the foundation of ethics itself. We need not impose external moral commands upon reluctant desires. We need only understand clearly what our deepest nature actually requires for its fullest expression. This sets the stage for exploring how our fundamental striving generates the entire spectrum of human emotions through its encounters with things that enhance or diminish our power. The joy of empowerment, the sadness of limitation, the hope of future enhancement, the fear of future diminishment. Spinoza constructs his theory of emotions on a foundation that revolutionizes our understanding of what we feel and why we feel it. Definition 2 states, joy is a person's passage from a lesser to a greater perfection. Definition 3 follows, sadness is a person's passage from a greater to a lesser perfection. These seemingly simple statements contain a profound insight. Our most fundamental emotional experiences track objective changes in our power of acting, making joy and sadness natural indicators of what enhances or diminishes our reality. This grounds emotions not in arbitrary subjective preferences, but in actual transformations of our capacities. We feel joy when our power genuinely increases, sadness when it genuinely decreases, whether we understand the causes or not. The merchant feels joy not merely because he prefers profit to loss, but because increased wealth genuinely expands his power to act in the world. The student experiences sadness at failure, not from social conditioning alone, but because diminished confidence and knowledge actually reduce her capacity to navigate reality effectively. Yet we rarely experience pure joy or sadness because our emotions become complex through their connection to ideas about external causes. Definition 6 reveals this. Love is joy, accompanied by the idea of an external cause. Definition 7 completes the pattern. Hatred is sadness, accompanied by the idea of an external cause. This exposes the cognitive structure of emotions. They combine bodily changes in our power with mental ideas about what causes those changes. Love and hatred thus prove more sophisticated than simple attraction and repulsion because they involve beliefs about causal relationships that may be accurate or confused. When we love someone, we experience joy and attribute that joy to their presence or influence. When we hate, we experience sadness and identify someone or something as responsible. But these attributions can be mistaken. We might love what actually harms us, or hate what genuinely benefits us, creating the emotional confusion that characterizes so much of human experience. This analysis reveals that hope, fear, anger, jealousy, and all other emotions are combinations of these basic elements with various ideas about their causes, giving emotional life a rational structure we can analyze and understand. Hope emerges as joy, accompanied by the idea of a future good whose occurrence remains uncertain. Fear manifests as sadness, accompanied by the idea of a future evil whose occurrence we cannot guarantee avoiding. Anger combines hatred with the idea that someone has deliberately harmed us, whilst jealousy weaves together fear, hatred, and fluctuating hope regarding someone we love. This systematic approach allows us to understand emotional patterns that otherwise seem chaotic or mysterious. The jealous lover experiences rapid oscillations between joy, imagining their beloved's affection, sadness, fearing loss, and hatred toward perceived rivals, because their emotional state depends on constantly shifting ideas about uncertain future events and other people's intentions. Emotions are not irrational disturbances but natural phenomena. With their own logic, they become problematic only when based on inadequate ideas about what truly enhances or diminishes our power. Spinoza's crucial insight follows. An emotion can only be controlled or destroyed by another emotion contrary thereto, and with more power for controlling emotion. This means we cannot simply eliminate emotions through willpower, but must cultivate more adequate emotions based on better understanding of what genuinely benefits our nature. The path forward requires recognizing how our emotional lives interweave with those of others through the mechanism of emotional imitation, creating the social dimension of human psychology. Human beings, Spinoza argues in Proposition 27 of the Ethics, naturally mirror the emotions of those they perceive as similar to themselves. When we imagine another person like us experiencing joy, sadness, fear, or anger, we spontaneously feel echoes of those same emotions, even when we have no direct knowledge of their causes. This emotional contagion operates below the threshold of conscious choice, making our inner lives far more porous and interconnected than we typically recognize. Consider how automatically this process unfolds. You witness a stranger's embarrassment and feel your own face flush with sympathetic discomfort. You observe someone's laughter and find yourself beginning to smile before you even understand the joke. These responses happen faster than rational deliberation, suggesting that emotional imitation constitutes a fundamental feature of human psychology rather than a learned social skill. Spinoza's insight reveals that our emotions are not entirely our own. They emerge partly through unconscious identification with others who resemble us in significant ways. This mechanism might initially appear to threaten individual autonomy by making us psychologically dependent on others' emotional states. If we automatically absorb the feelings of those around us, how can we maintain emotional independence or authentic self-expression? Yet Spinoza recognizes that this same process forms the foundation of human sociability itself. We cannot develop into fully realized human beings in complete isolation because our emotional capacities require cultivation through relationships with others. Children demonstrate this most clearly. They learn to feel by imitating their caregivers' emotional responses to the world. A mother's anxiety about strangers teaches her child wariness. A father's delight in music cultivates appreciation in his daughter. Through thousands of such interactions, children develop their emotional repertoires by unconsciously copying the feeling patterns of significant others. Adults continue this process throughout their lives, finding their moods influenced by their community's emotional atmospheres, their friends' enthusiasms, and their colleagues' frustrations. Spinoza observes that no one can live happily who is entirely isolated, not merely because we need practical cooperation, but because our psychological development depends on emotional relationships. Emotional imitation creates the basis for genuine moral concern. We naturally care about others' welfare because their emotions directly affect our own emotional states. When we see suffering in someone we identify with, we experience distress that motivates helping behavior. When we witness their joy, we feel pleasure that encourages us to support their flourishing. However, this same mechanism generates conflicts when our identifications clash with rational assessment of our genuine interests. We automatically love what our group loves and hate what they hate, often without examining whether these emotions serve our actual well-being. This creates what we might call tribal psychology. We feel hostility toward groups that threaten our group's identity, and we experience pride or shame based on our group's successes and failures, regardless of our personal involvement in these outcomes. Such automatic emotional reactions can lead to destructive prejudices and irrational conflicts. We might find ourselves feeling anger toward people we have never met, simply because they belong to groups our community defines as threatening. We might feel superior or inferior based on accidents of birth rather than our own actions and character. These responses follow the same natural pattern as beneficial emotional connections, but they operate without rational guidance about what genuinely enhances human flourishing. Understanding these mechanisms allows us to become more conscious participants in our emotional development. Rather than being merely passive recipients of whatever emotions our environment generates, we can begin to choose our identifications more deliberately. Spinoza launches his analysis of human psychology with a devastating critique that strikes at the heart of traditional thinking about human nature. Most people who have written about the emotions and human conduct, he observes, seem to be treating not of natural things that follow the common laws of nature, but of things outside nature. They conceive human beings in nature as a kingdom within a kingdom. This single insight encapsulates perhaps the most revolutionary aspect of Spinoza's entire philosophical system: the recognition that human psychology, including our emotions, desires, and moral choices follows exactly the same natural laws as physical phenomena. We are not exempt from nature's causal order, but are expressions of it. Every feeling of love or hatred, every surge of hope or fear, every moral decision emerges from prior causes according to discoverable patterns. Traditional approaches treat human behavior as if it were supernatural, creating unrealistic expectations about what humans can and should do. They imagine that we can simply decide to be different, that willpower alone should overcome desire, that moral exhortation can change fundamental psychological patterns. This creates a profound disconnect between how we actually function and how we think we should function. What does it mean to study human beings as natural phenomena? Spinoza applies his geometric method to psychology with the same precision he uses to analyze triangles and circles. Love arises when we experience joy, accompanied by the idea of an external cause. Hatred emerges when pain becomes associated with some object. Hope and fear follow predictable patterns based on our assessment of future possibilities. These are not mysterious forces beyond natural explanation, but natural processes as regular and understandable as the movement of planets or the growth of plants. This naturalistic approach doesn't diminish human dignity, but reveals the natural magnificence of beings capable of reason, creativity, and ethical development within the framework of natural law rather than in opposition to it. We are nature becoming conscious of itself, capable of understanding our own processes and thereby gaining a measure of self-direction. But this self-direction emerges from knowledge, not from some supernatural capacity to transcend natural causation. Traditional morality and psychology create immense suffering by ignoring our actual nature as natural beings. They condemn natural desires as sinful, expect people to change through willpower alone, and treat psychological problems as moral failures rather than natural phenomena with discoverable causes. Men are mistaken in thinking themselves free, Spinoza observes. Their opinion is made up of consciousness of their own volitions and ignorance of the causes which dispose them to will and desire. This ignorance leads to profoundly ineffective attempts at self-improvement that fight against natural tendencies rather than working skillfully with them. People struggle with guilt over desires they cannot control, exhaust themselves trying to force changes that contradict their fundamental nature, and blame themselves for psychological patterns that have clear natural causes. The result is a kind of warfare against oneself that produces more suffering than transformation. Understanding ourselves as natural phenomena allows for more effective and compassionate approaches to human development. We can treat psychological problems like medical conditions that can be understood and addressed through knowledge of their causes rather than moral condemnation. Depression, anxiety, destructive patterns of relationship, even ethical failures become phenomena to be investigated and understood rather than simply condemned or suppressed through force of will. This naturalistic approach actually increases human agency by revealing the actual mechanisms through which we might become more self-determining. When we understand the natural causes of our emotional patterns, we can work with them intelligently rather than fighting them blindly. We can create conditions that naturally support the states we want to cultivate and gradually modify the causes that produce states we want to change. Part 4. Human bondage, in Spinoza's precise formulation, occurs when a person is so constituted by external causes that they act according to them and not according to the necessity of their own nature. This is not metaphysical slavery, but psychological subjugation. We remain natural beings following natural laws, yet we follow them passively, as mere effects of external circumstances rather than as active expressions of our rational essence. Consider the person driven by fear who cannot sleep. consumed by scenarios that may never occur, or the individual swept up in anger, who says things they later regret. They act predictably, following psychological laws as reliable as physical ones, but they act as instruments of forces beyond their understanding, rather than as agents of their own rational nature. This bondage reveals itself most clearly in what we mistake for freedom. The common belief in arbitrary choice reflects precisely our ignorance of the external causes determining our desires. Men believe themselves free, Spinoza observes, simply because they are conscious of their actions and unconscious of the causes whereby those actions are determined. We experience the sensation of choosing whilst remaining blind to the complex web of influences shaping that very sensation. The person who declares they freely chose their career may be unconscious of how parental expectations, social pressures, and economic necessities narrowed their perceived options to a single viable path. This ignorance prevents genuine agency, because we cannot work skillfully with causal forces we refuse to acknowledge. The fantasy of arbitrary choice actually weakens us by preventing systematic self-understanding. When we attribute our actions to mysterious free will rather than comprehensible causes, we abandon the possibility of developing more effective strategies for living. We become like someone trying to navigate by denying that winds and currents affect their vessel, attributing every change of direction to pure intention, whilst remaining helpless before the actual forces determining their course. Passive affects serve as reliable indicators of this bondage. Fear, hatred, envy, and anger arise when external things exert more influence over our emotional state than our own rational understanding of what genuinely benefits us. Fear makes us reactive rather than proactive, constantly adjusting our behavior to avoid imagined threats rather than pursuing positive goals. Hatred consumes our mental energy in destructive fantasies about those who have harmed us, keeping us psychologically tethered to past injuries. Envy fixes our attention on what others possess rather than what we might develop, making our satisfaction dependent on comparisons rather than intrinsic achievements. These emotions create vicious cycles that increase our dependence on external circumstances. Hatred is increased by being reciprocated, Spinoza notes, and can, on the other hand, be destroyed by love. Is less than #0, 5# is greater than. The person who responds to hostility with counter-hostility finds themselves trapped in an escalating pattern where each party becomes more reactive, more predictable, more determined by the other's behavior. They experience themselves as responding to provocations, but they have become instruments in a mechanical process where their responses generate the very conditions that will provoke them further. Recognition of our bondage paradoxically begins our liberation. Understanding that we are part of nature's causal order, not exempt from it, reveals the actual mechanisms through which we might become more self-determining. When we acknowledge that our emotions follow discoverable patterns, that our desires have traceable origins, that our responses reflect our current level of understanding rather than arbitrary choices, we can begin working intelligently with these natural processes rather than being unconsciously driven by them. This naturalistic approach eliminates the false guilt that accompanies the fantasy of absolute responsibility, whilst opening realistic possibilities for development. We need not blame ourselves for being natural beings, subject to natural influences, but we can begin the patient work of understanding how those influences operate and how more adequate ideas might gradually reshape our emotional patterns. Spinoza begins his demolition of traditional religion with a psychological analysis that cuts to the bone. In the appendix to Part 1 of the Ethics, he reveals superstition as the inevitable product of a specific mental configuration, intense desire, combined with ignorance of causes. When we desperately want something but cannot understand the natural forces that might produce it, our minds create imaginary supernatural agents that respond to our pleas and rituals. The farmer who needs rain but knows nothing of meteorology invents rain dances. The sick person who faces illness without understanding medicine seeks miraculous cures. The merchant whose ships are lost at sea without knowledge of weather patterns prays to sea gods. This pattern emerges with mechanical necessity from human psychology itself. All the prejudices one here undertake to expose depend on this one. Spinoza observes that men commonly suppose that all natural things act, as men do, on account of an end. This single error generates the entire architecture of supernatural thinking. When we project human purposiveness onto natural events, we transform the systematic operations of nature into a drama of personal intentions. Floods and famines become divine punishments rather than meteorological processes. Recovery from disease becomes divine favor rather than immune system function. Even accidents acquire supernatural significance. If a stone falls from a roof onto someone's head and kills him, they will demonstrate that the stone fell in order to kill the man. This anthropomorphic interpretation of nature creates a profound obstacle to genuine understanding. Instead of learning the natural causes that might help us work more effectively with natural forces, we remain trapped in fantasies of supernatural intervention. The earthquake becomes divine anger to be appeased, rather than geological process to be understood and prepared for. The plague becomes moral punishment rather than bacterial infection to be prevented and treated. We waste our energy on rituals designed to influence imaginary supernatural agents instead of developing practical knowledge of natural causes and effects. Traditional religion systematizes these natural psychological tendencies into institutions of control. Religious authorities exploit people's ignorance and desperation by claiming special access to supernatural forces that can override natural laws. They promise divine protection in exchange for obedience, supernatural rewards in exchange for submission. The supreme mystery of despotism, its prop and stay, Spinoza reveals, is to keep men in a state of deception and with the specious title of religion to cloak the fear by which they must be held in check. Religion becomes a mechanism for preventing the development of rational autonomy by maintaining psychological dependence on supernatural authorities. The fantasy of escaping nature through supernatural salvation actually increases our bondage by preventing us from learning to work skillfully with natural forces, including our own emotional and rational capacities. The promise of transcending natural limitations leads to neglect of natural possibilities for development and flourishing. Instead of cultivating our understanding of what genuinely enhances human power and joy, we remain trapped in cycles of hope and fear that make us easy prey for those who claim to control supernatural forces. This psychological bondage manifests in the internal contradictions and emotional instability that characterize minds governed by inadequate ideas rather than rational understanding of their own nature and potential. The human mind in bondage reveals its deepest vulnerability through what Spinoza identifies as emotional fluctuation, a psychological state where our inner well-being becomes entirely dependent on external circumstances beyond our control. Consider Proposition 17 from the Ethics. If we imagine that a thing which usually affects us with an emotion of sadness is destroyed, we shall rejoice. This seemingly simple observation unveils the profound instability that characterizes most human emotional life. When we base our happiness on external things, whether another person's approval, financial security, political outcomes, or social status, we become subject to constant oscillation between hope and fear, joy and sadness, love and hatred. This emotional dependency creates what Spinoza terms fluctuation of mind, a condition where our psychological state mirrors the unpredictable changes in circumstances we cannot control. The person whose self-worth depends on professional success experiences elation with each achievement and despair with each setback. The individual who seeks validation through relationships swings between euphoria when loved and devastation when rejected. Such people live in perpetual psychological instability, their inner peace held hostage by forces entirely outside their influence. This external dependency generates internal contradiction, creating minds pulled simultaneously in opposing directions by conflicting desires rooted in inadequate ideas about what genuinely brings satisfaction. We simultaneously crave security and excitement, independence and belonging, immediate pleasure and long-term benefit. These contradictory impulses reflect our confused understanding of human nature itself. Spinoza observes that desire arising from joy is, other conditions being equal, stronger than desire arising from sadness. Yet our inadequate ideas often lead us to pursue what ultimately diminishes rather than enhances our power. The mind in bondage becomes internally fragmented when different aspects of our nature, immediate impulses, social conformity, moral ideals, rational reflection, operate according to incompatible principles, rather than being integrated through clear understanding of what genuinely promotes human flourishing. This psychological fragmentation manifests in self-defeating behaviors that reveal our internal contradictions. We know what would benefit us, yet consistently act against our own interests. We commit to meaningful goals, but systematically sabotage our efforts. We desperately seek happiness, but relentlessly pursue things that make us miserable. This internal conflict directly weakens our overall power by preventing the unified, coherent action that flows from clear understanding of our genuine interests and capacities. When different parts of our nature operate according to contradictory principles, we cannot achieve the psychological integration necessary for effective action in the world. Instead, we waste our energy in internal struggles, becoming vulnerable to external manipulation precisely because we lack stable internal principles to guide our choices. The fragmented mind becomes an easy target for those who would exploit our psychological instability. Political demagogues appeal to our fears whilst promising impossible securities. Commercial interests profit from our confusion about what genuinely satisfies human nature. Social pressures shape our desires according to external standards that may directly contradict our authentic development. Without clear understanding of our own nature and genuine interests, we remain perpetually susceptible to forces that would direct our power toward their ends rather than our own flourishing. This analysis of psychological bondage reveals why Spinoza considers most human suffering to be fundamentally unnecessary, the product of inadequate ideas about human nature rather than inevitable features of existence itself. The fluctuation of mind, internal contradiction, and psychological fragmentation that characterize emotional bondage all stem from confused understanding of what we are and what genuinely enhances our power. Part 5. The Ethics of Joy. Spinoza delivers perhaps his most revolutionary ethical insight through a single, devastating equation. By virtue and power, one mean the same thing. With these 8 words, he demolishes the entire edifice of traditional morality that sets virtue against human nature, demanding we suppress our desires to achieve goodness. For Spinoza, virtue becomes not the enemy of natural human flourishing, but its perfect expression. This redefinition transforms everything. Traditional ethics presents virtue as obedience to external commands, whether divine, social, or rational imperatives that stand opposed to what we naturally want. We must choose between being good and being ourselves. Spinoza recognizes this opposition as fundamentally mistaken. Virtue is precisely the power of acting according to our own rational nature. The person who strives and is able to seek his own advantage, that is, to preserve his being, Genuine self-interest becomes the foundation of ethics rather than its enemy. What emerges is an ethics without transcendence, without the need for supernatural authority or arbitrary commands to tell us how to live. Good and evil reveal themselves as relative terms describing what enhances or diminishes human power and flourishing. Spinoza cuts through centuries of moral mystification with characteristic precision. We strive for, wish for, long for, and desire nothing because we deem it to be good, but on the other hand, we deem a thing to be good because we strive for, wish for, long for, and desire it. Ethics becomes grounded in natural human development rather than supernatural obligations, making moral life an expression of health rather than a burden imposed on reluctant nature. This naturalistic foundation dissolves another false opposition that has plagued moral philosophy, the supposed conflict between reason and emotion. Traditional morality demands we suppress emotion in favor of cold, rational duty. Spinoza reveals this as another confusion. Rational emotions, those based on adequate ideas about reality, prove more powerful and satisfying than irrational ones based on confused understanding. When we grasp the natural causes of our emotions, we gain more skillful ways of cultivating joy, love, and satisfaction, whilst reducing the grip of fear, hatred, and despair. Reason doesn't oppose emotion, but generates its own distinctive spectrum of emotional life, the joy of understanding, love of truth, satisfaction in creative work. These rational emotions possess greater stability and depth than the fluctuating pleasures and pains that depend on external circumstances beyond our control. The person who finds genuine pleasure in mathematical discovery or philosophical insight has accessed sources of satisfaction that no external authority can grant or remove. Ethical development consists in reorganizing our emotional life around adequate ideas of what truly benefits human nature. This makes us more powerful, joyful, and free, rather than more constrained and guilt-ridden. Spinoza's naturalistic ethics affirms human life and creativity whilst providing rational guidance for individual and social flourishing. We need not choose between being good and being happy, between virtue and power, between reason and emotion. These apparent oppositions dissolve when we understand human nature properly and align our lives with what genuinely enhances our being. Spinoza fundamentally challenges our assumptions about the relationship between reason and emotion through a revolutionary insight. Reason doesn't merely control emotions. It generates its own distinct spectrum of feelings. In Proposition 58 of the Ethics, he declares that, besides joy and desire, which are passions, there are other emotions of joy and desire which are related to us insofar as we act. This seemingly technical distinction opens up an entirely new understanding of what it means to live rationally. Consider the joy you experience when solving a complex mathematical problem or the satisfaction that flows from creating something beautiful. These emotions don't arise from external circumstances imposing themselves upon you. They emerge from your own rational essence, expressing itself. When you grasp a difficult concept, or see the elegant structure underlying apparent chaos, the pleasure you feel is what Spinoza calls an active affect. Unlike passive emotions that diminish our power by making us dependent on external validation or circumstances, these rational emotions enhance our capacity to think, create, and act. This reveals something profound about human nature. We are not merely rational beings who happen to have emotions, nor emotional beings who sometimes think clearly. We are beings whose deepest rationality is itself emotional, whose clearest thinking generates its own forms of joy, wonder. The mathematician's delight in proof, the artist's satisfaction in creation, the philosophers wonder at existence. These represent emotions flowing from our own nature, rather than being imposed by forces beyond our control. This understanding transforms the relationship between self-love and ethics entirely. Spinoza demonstrates that rational self-love is not selfishness, but the foundation of genuine morality. We can only truly benefit others when we understand and cultivate our own authentic capacities and needs. The person who doesn't understand their own nature, who lives in constant reaction to external pressures and demands, has nothing genuine to offer others. But the person who develops their rational capacities, who learns to generate joy through understanding and creation, naturally becomes a source of enhancement for everyone around them. Spinoza captures this beautifully when he observes that he who rightly realizes that all things follow from the necessity of the divine nature and happen in accordance with the eternal laws and rules of nature will not find anything worthy of hatred, derision, or contempt. When we understand our own nature as expressions of nature's infinite creativity, this understanding naturally extends to others. We begin to see every person as a fellow expression of the same creative power that manifests in ourselves. Rational self-love becomes the basis for universal compassion because it's grounded in recognition of our fundamental interconnection. This rational self-understanding naturally extends beyond personal relationships to our relationship with existence itself. When we comprehend the systematic beauty of natural law, when we see how everything from planetary motion to human psychology operates according to discoverable patterns, we develop what might be called amor, fati, love of fate. This isn't passive resignation to circumstances beyond our control, but active appreciation for the rational structure that governs all existence. Understanding why things must be as they are creates a profound shift in our emotional relationship to limitation and necessity. Instead of resenting natural constraints, we begin to work skillfully within them. The musician doesn't rage against the mathematical relationships that determine harmony. They use those relationships to create beauty. The engineer doesn't fight against gravity. They harness gravitational forces to build structures that soar. This rational acceptance differs fundamentally from mere submission because it's based on understanding rather than ignorance, creating active participation in natural processes rather than passive endurance of external forces. This progression leads to what Spinoza considers the pinnacle of rational emotion: intellectual love of God, or nature. Spinoza's approach to emotional regulation begins with a striking proposition that challenges our intuitive beliefs about controlling our feelings. He argues that we cannot directly command our emotions through willpower alone, but we can influence them indirectly by changing the ideas upon which they are based. This insight emerges from his understanding that emotions are not mysterious forces beyond rational comprehension, but natural phenomena with discoverable causes. When we form clear and distinct ideas about our emotional states, we begin to transform our relationship to them. An emotion that operates as a passion, driving us compulsively, ceases to be merely a passion once we understand it clearly. Knowledge itself becomes the instrument of emotional transformation. Consider how this process unfolds in practice. When we experience jealousy, anger, or fear, our immediate impulse is often to suppress these feelings or to act upon them impulsively. Spinoza suggests a different path. We can examine the specific ideas that generate these emotions. Anger typically arises from the belief that someone has deliberately harmed us or acted against our interests. By investigating whether this belief accurately represents the situation, we create space between the initial emotional response and our subsequent actions. This understanding doesn't immediately dissolve the anger, but it weakens the emotion's compulsive power over us. We begin to see anger as one possible response among others, rather than as an inevitable reaction to circumstances. The formation of clear and distinct ideas about our emotional patterns creates genuine psychological freedom. When we understand the specific triggers, thought patterns, and bodily changes involved in our emotional responses, we gain more choice in how we engage with these feelings. This process resembles becoming conscious of previously unconscious habits. Once we recognize the pattern clearly, we can begin to modify it. Understanding that our anxiety often stems from imagining future disasters that may never occur allows us to question whether this mental activity serves our genuine well-being. We can learn to distinguish between reasonable concern about future challenges and the kind of anxious rumination that depletes our energy without producing useful solutions. Spinoza recognizes that this emotional regulation requires more than intellectual understanding alone. He advocates cultivating a wide range of interests and relationships to make ourselves less dependent on any particular external source of satisfaction. When our joy depends entirely on one person's approval or one activity's success, we become vulnerable to dramatic emotional fluctuations that characterize what he calls human bondage. By developing multiple sources of meaning and connection, we create emotional stability and resilience. This diversification doesn't mean becoming indifferent to particular relationships or pursuits, but rather avoiding the kind of exclusive dependence that makes us psychologically fragile. The mind's natural power of forming associations becomes a tool for deliberate emotional cultivation. Spinoza observes that we can learn to connect positive emotions with rational ideas and beneficial activities, gradually reshaping our spontaneous emotional responses through conscious practice. By repeatedly associating joy with understanding, love with truth, and satisfaction with creative work, we make these rational emotions more spontaneous and powerful than emotions based on external dependence or confused ideas. This process requires patience and consistency, as emotional patterns develop over time through repetition rather than sudden transformation. This deliberate cultivation of emotional associations reflects Spinoza's broader insight that the mind can bring all bodily modifications and images of things into relation with rational ideas. We can learn to experience our daily activities, relationships, and even challenges as expressions of the natural order that we are coming to understand more clearly. This perspective doesn't eliminate difficulty or conflict, but it places them within a larger framework of meaning that reduces their power to disturb our fundamental equanimity. Part 6. The free person. That thing is called free, which exists from the necessity of its nature alone and is determined to action by itself alone. Spinoza's definition cuts through centuries of philosophical confusion about human freedom with surgical precision. Freedom is not the ability to choose arbitrarily between options, as if genuine liberty consisted in random decision-making. Rather, freedom emerges when we act from our own rational essence, expressing what we truly are, rather than being driven by external forces or internal compulsions we don't understand. This transforms freedom from an absolute state into a matter of degree. We become progressively more free as we develop clearer understanding of our own nature and the natural forces that influence us. The person who recognizes their tendency toward anger can work skillfully with this emotional pattern rather than being blindly driven by it. They understand the circumstances that trigger rage, the thoughts that fuel it, the bodily tensions that accompany it. This knowledge doesn't eliminate the emotion but allows them to respond rather than merely react, channeling the energy constructively instead of destructively. The free person acts from knowledge rather than ignorance, from strength rather than weakness, from joy rather than fear. Their actions express authentic nature rather than mere reactions to external circumstances or social pressures. As Spinoza observes, the free man, who lives only according to the guidance of reason, is not led by fear of death, but directly desires the good. This freedom emerges through understanding. When we know what genuinely enhances our power and joy, we naturally choose it over what diminishes us, making virtuous action spontaneous rather than forced. Consider how this operates in practice. The person driven by social approval constantly adjusts their behavior to match others' expectations, never expressing their authentic nature. They mistake this reactive conformity for freedom of choice. But the genuinely free person understands their own values and capacities clearly enough to act from them consistently, regardless of external pressure. They're not rebellious for rebellion's sake, but neither are they conformist from weakness. They respond to each situation from their center of rational understanding. Here lies freedom's central paradox. Understanding necessity increases rather than eliminates liberty. Comprehending the causal forces that govern natural events, including human behavior, allows us to work skillfully with these forces rather than being blindly driven by them or futilely fighting against them. The sailor who understands wind patterns and ocean currents has more freedom to reach desired destinations than one who ignores these natural forces. Psychological freedom operates similarly. Understanding the causes of our emotions and desires gives us more skillful ways of achieving satisfaction and avoiding unnecessary suffering. This knowledge doesn't make us puppets of deterministic forces, but active participants in nature's unfolding creativity. When we understand how our minds work, how our bodies respond to different influences, how our relationships develop according to recognizable patterns, we can work with these natural processes rather than against them. The free person doesn't transcend nature, but expresses it most fully, becoming what Spinoza calls a singular manifestation of nature's infinite creativity. True autonomy emerges from aligning our individual nature with reality's rational structure itself. This alignment creates what Spinoza calls acquiescence in oneself, a deep satisfaction that comes from acting according to authentic nature rather than trying to be something we're not. The free person doesn't exhaust themselves fighting their natural tendencies, but channels them toward constructive expression. They work with their particular combination of abilities and limitations, rather than wasting energy on impossible transformations. This freedom manifests most clearly in the free person's relationship to mortality itself, their capacity to affirm life's creative possibilities despite inevitable limitations. Proposition 67 of Spinoza's Ethics presents one of philosophy's most paradoxical insights. The free person thinks least of all of death, and his wisdom is a meditation not on death, but on life. This seems to contradict everything we might expect from genuine wisdom. After all, death represents the ultimate limitation that makes all other constraints possible. If we cannot think clearly about our mortality, how can we understand anything else about the human condition? Traditional wisdom has long emphasized memento mori, remember death, as essential to philosophical insight. The Stoics counseled daily reflection on mortality to achieve proper perspective. Buddhist meditation begins with contemplating the inevitability of death. Christian mysticism finds in death's shadow the path to eternal life. Yet Spinoza argues that the truly free person, the one who has achieved genuine wisdom, thinks least of all about death. This is not denial. Spinoza never suggests we should ignore mortality or pretend death doesn't exist. Rather, he recognizes that obsessing over death, whether through desperate clinging to life or morbid fascination with its end, diminishes our actual power to live well. The person who constantly contemplates death either becomes paralyzed by anxiety or seeks escape through fantasies of transcendence that prevent full engagement with present possibilities. What does it mean, then, for wisdom to involve accepting the limitations and vulnerabilities that define finite existence? Is less than #0. 5 is greater than Spinoza argues that denying mortality leads to what he calls sad passions, desperate clinging, false transcendence fantasies, and the exhausting attempt to escape natural constraints. These responses actually diminish our power by directing energy away from what we can accomplish within our actual circumstances. The attempt to escape natural limitations through supernatural beliefs or technological fantasies represents a fundamental misunderstanding of human nature. We are not souls trapped in bodies, awaiting liberation into some higher realm. We are expressions of nature itself, temporary configurations of the same substance that constitutes everything else. Our power lies not in transcending these natural patterns, but in participating more fully and creatively within them. Spinoza writes, "The wise man, insofar as he is regarded as such, is scarcely at all disturbed in spirit, but being, by a certain eternal necessity, conscious of himself, and of God, and of things, he never ceases to be." This consciousness involves recognizing ourselves as temporary expressions of eternal patterns, finding peace not through escape, but through deeper participation in the creative processes of which we form a part. Yet acceptance alone proves insufficient. The wise person neither clings desperately to life nor seeks to escape it, but asks how to participate most fully in the creative processes of which human existence represents a temporary expression. Is less than #0. 5 is greater than. This creates what Spinoza calls blessedness. Not the absence of limitations, but the fullest possible expression of our nature within those constraints. This differs fundamentally from both hedonistic pleasure-seeking and ascetic life denial. The hedonist mistakes temporary pleasures for genuine fulfillment, whilst the ascetic mistakes the denial of natural impulses for spiritual achievement. Spinoza's wise person focuses instead on what genuinely enhances our power and reality as rational, creative, social beings. This involves cultivating our capacity for adequate ideas, forming meaningful relationships, and contributing to collective human flourishing. Contemplating death properly leads not to morbid preoccupation, but to greater appreciation of life's possibilities and more skillful use of our limited time and energy. Understanding mortality as natural rather than tragic creates urgency without desperation. We become more present to immediate experience, whilst simultaneously participating in patterns that extend far beyond our individual existence. This wise acceptance of finitude becomes the foundation for the highest form of human experience, blessedness, through intellectual love of the eternal patterns that express themselves through temporal existence. At the pinnacle of Spinoza's ethics stands one of philosophy's most audacious claims. The mind's intellectual love of God is the very love of God by which God loves himself. This isn't mystical poetry, but the logical culmination of everything we've explored. The lived experience of blessedness emerges when the free person recognizes their deepest emotions and highest understanding as identical with the creative intelligence governing all existence. Spinoza calls this intellectual love because it flows from adequate knowledge rather than confused imagination. When we truly comprehend natural patterns, whether grasping a mathematical proof, understanding the mechanics of emotion, or seeing through the illusions that generate human conflict, we experience something more than mere satisfaction. The clarity itself generates profound joy, not as a reward for thinking, but as thinking's natural emotional dimension. Understanding and loving become indistinguishable because to see reality clearly is to recognize its intrinsic perfection, its rational necessity, its creative abundance. This love is intellectual precisely because it requires no leap beyond reason. The geometer doesn't need faith to feel wonder at the elegant necessity of geometric relationships. The psychologist studying human emotions doesn't require mystical experience to feel deep satisfaction in understanding how passions arise and transform. The naturalist observing ecological systems doesn't need supernatural beliefs to experience awe at nature's creative complexity. In each case, adequate knowledge generates its own emotional fulfillment, what Spinoza identifies as our participation in God's own self-love. But what does this participation mean experientially? In moments of genuine understanding, the boundaries between our individual thinking and the infinite intellect that Spinoza calls God become transparent. We experience ourselves not as separate minds observing external objects, but as temporary expressions of nature's eternal thinking process. When the mathematician grasps a proof, when the scientist understands a natural law, when the artist perceives the underlying patterns in human experience, they participate directly in the same rational creativity that governs all natural processes. Spinoza captures this precisely. The intellectual love of the mind towards God is that very love of God whereby God loves himself, not insofar as he is infinite, but insofar as he can be explained through the essence of the human mind regarded under the form of eternity. Our finite understanding becomes a localized expression of infinite understanding. Our individual joy in comprehension becomes a particular manifestation of the cosmic joy that Spinoza identifies with existence itself. This mystical dimension, and Spinoza doesn't shy away from the term, provides practical wisdom rather than escape from ordinary life. Understanding our participation in eternal patterns transforms our relationship to temporal concerns. They become simultaneously more meaningful and less overwhelming. More meaningful because every genuine creative act, every moment of clear thinking, every expression of human flourishing participates in the eternal creativity that constitutes reality's deepest nature. Less overwhelming because individual successes and failures occur within a larger rational structure that transcends any particular outcome. This generates what Spinoza calls acquiescence, deep satisfaction that doesn't depend on external circumstances because it flows from understanding our essential nature. The free person experiences profound contentment not because their desires are satisfied, but because they understand the rational necessity governing all desire, including their own. They find peace not by escaping human limitations, but by comprehending how those limitations express eternal patterns of natural creativity. Crucially, the free person lives in this blessedness not as rare peak experiences, but as their characteristic emotional tone. This represents Spinoza's naturalistic salvation, requiring no supernatural beliefs while connecting us to something genuinely infinite and eternal. Part 7. The Social Contract, Reimagined. Political communities do not arise from desperate individuals surrendering their natural freedom to escape a brutal state of nature. This familiar story, told by Hobbes and others, fundamentally misunderstands both human nature and the origins of political life. Spinoza reveals something far more profound. Political organization emerges naturally from human beings' need for cooperation to enhance their individual and collective power. We are, as he observes, social animals not by choice, but by natural necessity. Our rational and creative capacities cannot develop in isolation because human flourishing requires language, education, economic cooperation, and cultural development that are only possible in communities. This transforms our understanding of the social contract entirely. Rather than a historical event where free individuals made a bargain with authority, the social contract becomes an ongoing process where people discover that individual flourishing requires stable social cooperation. The opposition between personal freedom and political authority dissolves because both serve the same fundamental drive. As Spinoza puts it, the right of the sovereign power is nothing but natural right itself. Political authority and individual striving express the same natural force, the enhancement of human power and flourishing. This eliminates the artificial tension between individual rights and legitimate government by showing that both aim at developing human capacities. This insight establishes a revolutionary principle. Natural right extends as far as natural power, which means political legitimacy depends on effectiveness in promoting human flourishing rather than abstract moral authority or traditional claims to rule. Governments are legitimate insofar as they actually enhance their citizens' capacities for rational thought, creative work, and social cooperation. Historical precedent, divine appointment, or theoretical consent matter far less than practical results. Spinoza observes that the end of the state is not to dominate men, nor to restrain them by fear. Rather, it is so to free each man from fear that he may live and act with full security and without injury to himself or his neighbor. The purpose of political organization therefore becomes creating conditions where human beings can develop their rational and creative capacities, not merely preventing conflict or maintaining order. This requires positive institutions, education, arts, sciences, economic opportunity, rather than just negative constraints on harmful behavior. A naturalistic understanding of political life points toward democratic forms of government that reflect the collective wisdom and power of communities rather than subordinating many to the arbitrary will of few. The social contract, properly understood, is nature's own design for human flourishing through cooperative enhancement of individual and collective power. Spinoza's political philosophy begins with a revolutionary premise. Democracy represents the most natural form of government, precisely because it mirrors the actual distribution of power and wisdom within human communities. Rather than artificially concentrating authority in the hands of one or few, democracy recognizes that collective intelligence and judgment emerge from the participation of many rational beings working together. This isn't merely an idealistic preference, but a recognition of political reality. When citizens deliberate together, they draw upon diverse experiences and perspectives that no single ruler, however wise, could possibly possess. The democratic process allows this distributed wisdom to inform collective decisions, making government an expression of communal rationality rather than individual will imposed upon others. This participation transforms citizens from passive subjects into active agents of their own governance. In democracy, people follow laws they have helped create through rational deliberation, rather than submitting to arbitrary commands from external authority. Spinoza observed that dominion is best where men pass their lives in unity, and the laws are kept unbroken, and democracy achieves this unity through inclusion rather than coercion. When people participate in creating the rules that govern them, they understand those rules as expressions of their own rational nature rather than alien impositions. This creates genuine consent, not the grudging submission that characterizes authoritarian systems. The relationship between individual freedom and political authority reveals itself as fundamentally complementary rather than antagonistic when government genuinely serves human flourishing. Good laws don't restrict individual development, but provide the stable framework within which people can pursue their goals without constant conflict or insecurity. Spinoza argued that the object of government is not to change men from rational beings into beasts or puppets, but to enable them to develop their minds and bodies in security and to employ their reason unshackled. This makes political freedom and individual freedom mutually supporting values. The security provided by just laws allows individuals to develop their capacities, whilst individuals exercising their rational capacities contribute to the wisdom and stability of the political community. This understanding exposes the inherent instability of absolute monarchy and theocracy. These systems concentrate power in ways that conflict with the natural distribution of human capacities and interests, creating resentment and resistance that ultimately weaken the state itself. When rulers ignore their subjects' rational interests and natural desires, they create the very conditions for rebellion and social breakdown they claim to prevent. Absolute power corrupts not only rulers, who lose touch with the reality of their subjects' lives, but also subjects who become either servile or rebellious, rather than developing the rational capacities that make stable cooperation possible. History demonstrates repeatedly how such systems collapse under the weight of their own contradictions. The best government, therefore, governs least, by creating social conditions where people's natural pursuit of rational self-interest spontaneously promotes the common good. This requires institutions that align individual and collective interests, rather than trying to suppress individual nature in favor of abstract social goals. Such alignment becomes possible when people understand that their own flourishing depends upon the flourishing of the community, and when political institutions reflect this interdependence rather than obscuring it through artificial hierarchies or mystical justifications for power. Spinoza recognized that forcing religious belief creates precisely the psychological fragmentation that destroys both genuine faith and political stability. When the state attempts to enforce religious orthodoxy, it compels citizens to split themselves between public conformity and private conviction, generating the very internal contradictions that prevent the integration of thought and action characteristic of rational freedom. This enforced duplicity breeds resentment rather than devotion, hypocrisy rather than genuine piety. As Spinoza observed with devastating clarity, no one can be forced to be blessed because authentic religious experience requires conviction that emerges from within, not compliance imposed from without. The psychological mechanics of forced belief reveal why religious coercion undermines its own purposes. When people must profess beliefs they do not hold, they develop habits of intellectual dishonesty that corrupt both their relationship to truth and their capacity for genuine religious feeling. The state that attempts to control religious doctrine creates subjects who learn to manipulate religious language for political advantage rather than citizens who can draw upon authentic spiritual resources for moral guidance. This produces exactly the superstition and manipulation that Spinoza saw as religion's greatest corruption. Spinoza's revolutionary approach to biblical interpretation provides the foundation for separating religious and philosophical domains without diminishing either. The Bible, he argued, should be understood as a practical guide to moral behavior for ordinary people rather than a source of philosophical truth about reality's ultimate nature. This recognition allows both religion and philosophy to function according to their own internal logic, without mutual interference. Through his method of interpreting Scripture through Scripture itself, using historical and literary analysis rather than philosophical speculation, Spinoza showed how to respect the Bible's actual function whilst freeing rational inquiry from scriptural constraints. This separation reveals that philosophy and religion serve fundamentally different functions in human life. Philosophy seeks truth through reason and systematic analysis, developing understanding for those capable of sustained intellectual work. Religion promotes social cooperation through shared narratives and rituals that engage the imagination and emotions of people who may lack either the capacity or inclination for philosophical speculation. Both remain necessary for complete human development because reason provides understanding and guidance for some, whilst religion provides moral motivation and social cohesion for broader communities. Spinoza captured this distinction perfectly. The sphere of reason is truth and wisdom. The sphere of theology is piety and obedience. Neither sphere should dominate the other because each addresses different aspects of human nature and social need. When philosophy attempts to replace religion entirely, it fails to provide the emotional and imaginative resources that most people require for moral motivation. When religion attempts to control philosophical inquiry, it corrupts both the search for truth and the authentic spiritual development that emerges from genuine understanding rather than imposed doctrine. The state's proper role becomes protecting religious practice, whilst refusing to enforce religious doctrine, creating conditions where both philosophical inquiry and religious devotion can develop according to their own internal principles, rather than being subordinated to political control. This protection of religious freedom serves political stability by preventing the religious conflicts that destroy social peace, whilst allowing genuine spiritual development to flourish when freed from the superstition and manipulation that traditional religious authority typically generates. Part 8. The Critique of Traditional Religion. Spinoza's approach to biblical criticism strikes at the heart of centuries of theological assumption with devastating simplicity. Scripture was written by human beings in particular historical circumstances to address specific practical and spiritual needs. This obvious fact, when taken seriously rather than being obscured by layers of theological interpretation, transforms our entire understanding of these texts. The theological political treatise applies this principle with systematic precision, analyzing biblical passages as historical documents that reflect their author's knowledge, cultural limitations, and immediate purposes rather than timeless divine revelations. The revolutionary insight emerges from Spinoza's recognition that the method of interpreting Scripture does not widely differ from the method of interpreting nature. In fact, it is almost the same. Just as we understand natural phenomena by examining their causes, contexts, and effects, we must approach biblical texts through historical and literary analysis rather than theological speculation. This means considering authorship, intended audience, cultural background, and practical objectives exactly as we would with any ancient document. When Moses describes the sun standing still, we need not torture ourselves with impossible astronomical explanations or retreat into metaphorical interpretations that drain the text of meaning. Instead, we recognize that Moses, writing for his contemporaries, naturally employed the observational language of his time to convey the extraordinary nature of the event he wished to describe. This method immediately explains what theologians have struggled to reconcile for millennia: apparent contradictions, factual errors, and varying literary styles throughout Scripture reflect diverse human authorship across different historical periods, rather than mysterious divine purposes beyond human comprehension. The creation accounts in Genesis need not be harmonized through elaborate exegetical gymnastics when we understand them as separate traditions addressing different aspects of humanity's relationship with the natural world. The varying legal codes reflect evolving social circumstances rather than contradictory divine commands. One may sum up the matter by saying that the method of interpreting Scripture is no different from the method of interpreting nature, and is in complete accord with it. Spinoza observes, establishing a unified approach to understanding both domains through reason rather than authority. The Bible's actual function becomes clear once we abandon assumptions about supernatural origin. These texts provided moral guidance and social cohesion through narratives and laws carefully adapted to particular historical circumstances, rather than delivering eternal philosophical truths about reality's fundamental nature. The Mosaic Law Code reveals sophisticated practical wisdom about social organization, economic justice, and community maintenance rather than arbitrary divine preferences. Dietary restrictions reflect genuine health considerations in pre-refrigeration societies. Sabbath observance creates necessary rhythms of rest and communal gathering. Jubilee year provisions prevent the concentration of wealth and land that destroys social stability. Understanding these laws' human origins and practical purposes actually increases rather than diminishes their value by revealing how successfully they promoted justice, compassion, and cooperation amongst ancient peoples facing concrete social challenges. This naturalistic approach liberates both reason and religion from their artificial conflict. Reason can pursue truth about the natural world without being constrained by scriptural cosmologies that reflect ancient rather than modern understanding. Religion can focus on its genuine spiritual and moral functions and human flourishing, rather than defending scientifically obsolete worldviews or historically inaccurate narratives that become increasingly implausible as human knowledge advances. Spinoza's assault on miraculous intervention cuts to the heart of traditional religious authority. If miracles truly occurred as violations of natural law, they would contradict the eternal laws through which God nature expresses its essence. This creates an impossible paradox. Either miracles are impossible, or they provide evidence against God's existence rather than proof of divine power. Since Spinoza identifies God completely with nature, any violation of natural laws would constitute self-contradiction in the divine nature itself. As he declares, "Nothing happens in nature which does not follow from her laws, and these laws extend to everything, and nature keeps a fixed and immutable order." This reasoning transforms our understanding of biblical narratives entirely. What ancient peoples interpreted as supernatural interventions were either natural events that appeared miraculous to minds ignorant of their causes, or literary devices crafted to convey spiritual truths rather than historical reports. The parting of waters becomes a dramatic low tide or wind phenomenon. Healing miracles reflect psychological and medical processes not yet understood. Prophetic visions emerge from the natural workings of unusually creative minds rather than divine dictation. Expanding scientific knowledge continuously reveals natural explanations for previously mysterious phenomena. What seemed miraculous to ancient audiences becomes comprehensible through meteorology, psychology, medicine, and astronomy. The brilliant comet that announced a king's birth follows predictable orbital mechanics. The plague that struck Egypt's firstborn reflects natural disease patterns. The prophetic dreams arise from the mind's capacity to synthesize moral insights through vivid imagery. Prophetic insight itself represents unusually powerful moral and spiritual imagination rather than supernatural revelation. The great prophets were poets and ethical teachers who wielded compelling narrative and imagery to promote justice and compassion. They were not metaphysicians providing information about natural causes or historians recording supernatural events. Spinoza observes that the prophets were endowed with unusually vivid imaginations, and not with unusually perfect minds. Their moral insights remain profoundly valuable when separated from cosmological claims that conflict with scientific understanding. This analysis preserves what matters most in prophetic literature, whilst liberating it from factual claims that scientific inquiry has superseded. Isaiah's vision of justice flowing like waters and Ezekiel's imagery of spiritual transformation speak to universal human experiences of moral awakening and social responsibility. These insights transcend the particular historical circumstances and limited scientific understanding of their original contexts. True reverence for God nature involves appreciating the sublime rationality and creativity expressed through natural laws rather than seeking arbitrary interventions that would disrupt nature's perfect order. Understanding natural causes increases rather than diminishes wonder by revealing the elegant complexity and systematic beauty governing all processes. The spiral of a nautilus shell, the precise mechanics of planetary motion, the intricate chemistry of consciousness itself. These natural phenomena inspire greater awe than any alleged violation of natural order could achieve. This naturalistic approach to religion opens toward a universal spiritual vision that transcends particular theological doctrines, whilst preserving the essential religious insight about love, compassion, and human flourishing. When we cease demanding supernatural validation for spiritual truths, we discover that those truths stand on their own merit as expressions of human wisdom about how to live well together. Spinoza's revolutionary vision of religion emerges from a profound insight. Beneath the bewildering diversity of theological doctrines, ritual practices, and historical claims that divide religious communities lies a simple, universal core that transcends all particular traditions. This essential message appears with striking consistency across different cultures and epochs. For Spinoza, this represents the universal divine law that constitutes genuine religious wisdom, separable from the specific metaphysical beliefs, cultural practices, and historical narratives that create sectarian division. The beauty of this insight lies in its accessibility. People can embrace this ethical core whilst maintaining diverse theological commitments or even philosophical skepticism about supernatural claims. This universal religion operates through emotional and imaginative engagement with our place in the larger whole of existence, complementing rather than competing with rational understanding. Religious practices serve crucial psychological and social functions precisely because they connect individuals to something greater than narrow self-concern. Ritual, prayer, meditation, and community worship cultivate compassion, humility, and social cooperation through experiential rather than purely intellectual means. The value of these practices lies not in their theoretical accuracy about supernatural realities, but in their practical effects on human character and community life. They create the emotional conditions necessary for ethical behavior whilst fostering the sense of belonging and purpose that rational argument alone cannot provide. Religious diversity reflects the natural variety of human temperaments and cultural contexts, rather than fundamental disagreement about spiritual truth. Different communities develop distinctive ways of expressing and cultivating the same basic insights about love, compassion, and our connection to the larger whole of existence. This makes tolerance both practically wise and spiritually appropriate. Forcing uniformity in religious expression violates the natural diversity through which universal spiritual truths manifest in particular communities. As Spinoza observes, every man's true happiness and blessedness consists solely in the enjoyment of what is good, not in the pride that he alone is enjoying it, to the exclusion of others. True religious understanding generates inclusivity rather than exclusivity. The highest form of religious life converges with philosophical wisdom in transcending narrow self-concern through understanding our connection to something greater than individual existence. Whether conceived as God, nature, the universe, or the human community, this recognition transforms our emotional relationship to reality itself. The convergence creates possibilities for spiritual fulfillment that integrates reason and faith rather than forcing a choice between them. This philosophical and religious synthesis becomes profoundly therapeutic, healing psychological suffering through rational understanding, combined with spiritual practice, preparing us to explore how such integration transforms human consciousness itself. Part 9. The Therapeutic Dimension. Spinoza approached philosophy as a physician approaches disease, by identifying the natural causes of human suffering and developing systematic methods for addressing them at their source. The ethics function simultaneously as theoretical analysis and practical therapy, revealing that most psychological distress stems from confused ideas about what we need for happiness. We pursue things that cannot provide lasting satisfaction, or we become entirely dependent on external circumstances beyond our control. When we understand that the more we understand particular things, the more do we understand God, we discover that comprehending our own psychological patterns connects us to universal principles governing all natural phenomena, including human emotions and desires. This therapeutic method involves understanding the natural causes of our emotional patterns, which reduces their compulsive power over us and creates space for more rational and satisfying responses. Consider jealousy. It arises from comparing ourselves to others, combined with inadequate ideas about what makes us valuable. By understanding both the comparison habit and the underlying insecurity, we can address the root causes rather than merely managing symptoms. Spinoza establishes that an emotion can only be controlled or destroyed by another emotion, contrary thereto, and with more power for controlling emotion. Knowledge itself becomes a more powerful emotion than ignorance-based fears and desires, transforming our entire relationship to psychological challenges. The geometric method applied to human psychology reveals the logical structure underlying apparently chaotic emotional experiences. The definitions, propositions, and proofs in parts 3 and 4 of the Ethics create a comprehensive map of human emotional life, allowing us to navigate psychological challenges with mathematical precision. This systematic approach prevents us from being overwhelmed by emotional complexity by revealing the underlying patterns that govern psychological phenomena. What seems unpredictable becomes manageable through systematic analysis. The therapeutic goal is not eliminating emotions but replacing passive, confused emotions with active, rational ones that enhance our power and joy. This differs fundamentally from suppressive approaches that eliminate emotional life, and permissive approaches that accept all emotions as equally valid. Understanding the causes of negative emotions, whilst cultivating positive emotions based on adequate ideas about genuine human flourishing, creates a pathway towards psychological freedom that neither suppresses nor indulges, but transforms through comprehension. Hatred dissolves when we understand that those who harm us are themselves acting from ignorance or compulsion rather than free malice. They are more pitiable than blameworthy because they are driven by forces they don't understand. Spinoza observed that hatred is increased by being reciprocated, and can, on the other hand, be destroyed by love. This isn't mere moral advice. It's a psychological truth about how emotions actually operate. When someone acts cruelly, they do so because they believe, however mistakenly, that cruelty will secure something they need. They might be driven by past trauma, social conditioning, or simply the confused notion that dominating others will make them safe or important. Understanding these natural causes makes compassionate response more rational than vengeful reaction, because it addresses causes rather than merely reacting to effects. Revenge perpetuates the cycle of ignorance and suffering, whilst understanding breaks it. Fear operates similarly, losing its grip when we distinguish realistic assessment of genuine dangers from anxious fantasies about imaginary threats. Most fear involves confused ideas about what threatens us and what we need for security. We become paralyzed by possibilities that exist only in imagination, whilst failing to respond appropriately to actual risks. Spinoza noted that he who lives according to the guidance of reason endeavors, as far as possible, to render back love or kindness for other men's hatred, anger, contempt, etc. Rational assessment of actual dangers allows for appropriate caution without the psychological suffering caused by chronic anxiety. When we fear losing our job, we can either spiral into catastrophic thinking about homelessness and humiliation, or we can assess what skills we need to develop and what practical steps might secure our position. The former multiplies suffering without solving problems. The latter transforms fear into productive action. Envy transforms into admiration when we recognize others' excellence as demonstrating human possibilities we might develop rather than evidence of our inadequacy. Envy reflects confused ideas about human nature. It assumes that others' success diminishes our own possibilities rather than revealing what human beings can accomplish. This confusion makes us enemies of the very examples that could inspire our own development. When we see someone excel at music, scholarship, or character, envy whispers that their achievement proves life is unfair, that we lack essential qualities, or that their success somehow reduces what's available to us. Understanding our own potential for development makes others' achievements inspiring rather than threatening. They show what we might become through our own efforts rather than what we lack through cosmic injustice. The musician's skill reveals music's possibilities. The scholar's insight demonstrates reason's power. The person of character shows what human nature can achieve. Anger becomes rational problem-solving rather than destructive retaliation when we focus on changing conditions that generate frustration rather than punishing those who trigger our anger. Anger often reflects unrealistic expectations about how others should behave, combined with inadequate strategies for achieving our goals. We expect people to act reasonably when they lack the knowledge or power to do so, then rage at them for failing to meet impossible standards. Instead of demanding that others change to accommodate our needs, we can ask, what conditions would make cooperation more likely? Instead of punishing failure, we can create systems that encourage success. The angry parent achieves more by understanding what motivates their child than by expressing righteous indignation at misbehavior. The frustrated citizen accomplishes more by organizing for structural change than by condemning individual politicians. This systematic approach to transforming negative emotions naturally leads toward cultivating positive emotions that provide more stable and satisfying sources of joy than external circumstances can offer. Spinoza's therapeutic philosophy reveals how understanding our place in nature naturally generates profound emotional transformation. His insight that we are finite expressions of infinite reality provides the foundation for cultivating positive emotions that arise not from wishful thinking or forced optimism, but from accurate perception of our actual situation in the world. Gratitude emerges spontaneously when we truly comprehend how our existence depends on countless favorable conditions and supportive relationships. Most of these we take entirely for granted until they're absent or threatened. The air we breathe, the food that nourishes us, the social institutions that provide security, the biological processes that maintain our health, the natural systems that sustain all life. These represent an intricate web of dependencies that normally remain invisible to consciousness. Spinoza recognized that acknowledging our interdependence with natural and social processes generates appreciation rather than resentment for our limitations and dependencies. This recognition transforms our relationship to vulnerability itself. Rather than experiencing our need for others and for favorable circumstances as shameful weakness, we begin to see it as the natural condition of finite beings who participate in larger patterns of existence. Gratitude practice involves systematically attending to the conditions that make our lives possible. From the most basic biological functions to the most complex cultural achievements is less than #0. 5# is greater than this. Attention naturally generates joy and love, rather than the anxiety and resentment that come from focusing primarily on what we lack or fear losing. Wonder and curiosity represent rational emotions that connect us to the infinite richness of natural reality, providing inexhaustible sources of interest and joy that don't depend on external circumstances or other people's approval. Spinoza observed that the more we understand particular things, the more do we understand God. This insight reveals how genuine learning creates renewable sources of satisfaction, because reality itself is infinitely complex and beautiful. Every phenomenon, from the behavior of subatomic particles to the development of human cultures, participates in patterns that extend beyond our current understanding. Wonder differs fundamentally from mere entertainment because it involves active engagement with real patterns and relationships rather than passive consumption of artificial stimulation. When we cultivate genuine interest in learning, whether through science, art, philosophy, or careful attention to daily experience, we tap into sources of satisfaction that grow stronger rather than weaker with use. The scientist discovering new principles, the artist exploring new forms of expression, the gardener observing seasonal changes, all participate in the same fundamental activity of mind, encountering the creative power of nature. Compassion flows naturally from recognizing our fundamental similarity to other human beings who share the same basic needs, vulnerabilities, and capacities for both suffering and flourishing. Understanding human nature as universal makes others' struggles comprehensible rather than alien, generating empathy based on rational insight rather than mere emotional contagion. When we see someone experiencing fear, anger, or sadness, we recognize states we have experienced ourselves under similar circumstances. This rational compassion proves more stable than sentimental sympathy because it's based on understanding rather than mood, making it available even when we don't feel spontaneous affection for particular individuals. We can extend compassion to difficult people by recognizing that their harmful behavior typically arises from the same confused ideas and painful emotions that sometimes drive our own worst actions. This doesn't excuse destructive behavior, but it allows us to respond from wisdom rather than reactive hatred. The practice of forming adequate ideas gradually reshapes our spontaneous emotional responses, making joy, love, and peace more natural and accessible than anxiety, hatred, and inner conflict. This process requires patience and systematic practice rather than sudden transformation, but creates lasting changes in our characteristic emotional tone. Part 10. The Community of Reason. Rational friendship occupies a unique place in Spinoza's vision of human flourishing, representing relationships that transcend mere emotional attachment or shared convenience. For Spinoza, genuine friendship emerges from mutual recognition and appreciation of each other's distinctive excellences, the particular ways each person embodies rationality, creativity, and joy. This stands in sharp contrast to relationships built on neediness, validation seeking, or simple compatibility of temperament. True friends, in Spinoza's understanding, see and actively support what is best in each other. They recognize the capacities for understanding, creative expression, and joyful engagement that make each person uniquely valuable. This recognition creates a dynamic fundamentally different from relationships based on emotional dependency or shared grievances. As Spinoza observes, men can differ in nature insofar as they are torn by emotions which are passions, but insofar as they agree in nature, they are most powerful. Rational friendship represents this agreement in nature, not uniformity of opinion or taste, but alignment in the commitment to developing human capacities for understanding and creative action. Such friendship naturally becomes a source of mutual enhancement because developing our own rational and creative capacities makes us better companions, collaborators, and sources of wisdom for others. This creates remarkable positive feedback loops. As we become more rational, creative, and joyful, we attract and inspire similar development in those around us. The result is communities of mutual enhancement rather than competition or codependence. Each person's growth contributes to an environment where others can flourish more fully. Spinoza captures this dynamic in his observation that nothing is more useful to man than man. This seemingly simple statement carries profound implications for how we understand self-development and social relationship. Genuine self-cultivation, the development of our capacities for understanding, creativity, and joy, naturally serves others' interests because human beings flourish in environments where rationality, compassion, and creative expression are cultivated and celebrated. The rational person discovers that their own flourishing and the flourishing of others are not competing interests but mutually reinforcing aspects of a single process. This understanding reveals why the community of reason naturally expands rather than remaining an exclusive circle. Rational insights and practices prove their value by promoting human flourishing in ways that become evident to anyone willing to experiment with rational approaches to life's challenges. Philosophical wisdom spreads through example and dialogue rather than through coercion or propaganda, making it inherently democratic and inclusive. People are drawn to rational communities not through pressure or persuasion, but through witnessing the enhanced creativity, resilience, and joy that characterize such relationships. The community of reason welcomes diversity of temperament, talent, and cultural background because rational people recognize that different individuals contribute different insights and capacities to collective understanding and creative projects. Unity emerges not from uniformity but from shared commitment to the development of human potential in all its varied expressions. Each person's distinctive excellences become resources for the community's collective wisdom and creative capacity. This vision of rational friendship transforms our understanding of what relationships can accomplish. Rather than simply providing comfort, validation, or entertainment, they create relationships that enhance rather than limit individual growth, while building genuine community based on shared commitment to human flourishing. Spinoza's approach to sexual love cuts through centuries of moral confusion with characteristic directness. At its finest, sexuality combines bodily pleasure with genuine appreciation for another person's distinctive human qualities. This creates joy that enhances both partners' power and understanding rather than diminishing them through possessiveness or objectification. Sexual attraction becomes the foundation for deeper relationship when it leads to authentic interest in the other person's thoughts, feelings, creative capacities, and individual development. The body's capacity for complex experience directly connects to the mind's capacity for understanding. As Spinoza observed, the body's aptitude for doing many things simultaneously and having many things done to it simultaneously. The more the mind is apt for understanding many things simultaneously. Physical intimacy can enhance, rather than compete, with intellectual and emotional connection. The lover who appreciates their partner's bodily responses also develops greater sensitivity to their mental and emotional nature. Touch becomes a form of knowledge, pleasure a pathway to deeper comprehension of another consciousness. This understanding immediately challenges possessive jealousy, which Spinoza recognized as reflecting confused ideas about love itself. Genuine love wants the beloved to flourish according to their own nature, rather than exist solely for our satisfaction or conform to our expectations and needs. Possessiveness actually undermines the very qualities that make someone lovable: their autonomy, creativity, and capacity for joy. By attempting to control rather than appreciate their independent development. Spinoza's insight that he who loves God cannot endeavor that God should love him in return, applies directly to human relationships. True love concerns itself more with the beloved's flourishing than with receiving specific responses or commitments. Though it naturally hopes for mutual affection and care, the possessive lover tries to capture and contain what they love, inevitably destroying it in the process. The mature lover creates conditions where the beloved can express their authentic nature most fully, knowing that this authenticity is precisely what sparked love initially. The ethics of relationship flow from understanding what genuinely promotes human flourishing rather than from external rules or social conventions that may conflict with authentic human needs and natural diversity in temperament, orientation, and life circumstances. This requires honest communication about desires, boundaries, and expectations rather than assuming that social norms or traditional roles automatically serve everyone's interests. Different people possess different capacities for intimacy, commitment, and sexual expression, making ethical relationships depend on mutual understanding and consent rather than conformity to universal standards. Lasting partnerships require compatibility in fundamental values and life direction, not merely emotional or physical attraction. Sustainable joy depends on shared understanding of what makes life meaningful and mutual support for each other's authentic development. This creates relationships that enhance rather than limit individual growth, whilst building genuine intimacy based on knowing and appreciating each other's actual nature rather than idealized projections. Such relationships become laboratories for developing the very capacities: honesty, empathy, rational communication that enable broader human community based on wisdom rather than mere convention or power. Human reason, Spinoza understood, flourishes not in isolation, but through dialogue with other rational minds. When individuals engage in genuine intellectual exchange, bringing different perspectives and experiences to shared inquiry, they create collective understanding that exceeds what any single person could achieve alone. This isn't mere pooling of opinions, but the emergence of insights that arise only through the dynamic interaction of diverse, rational perspectives. Each person's unique vantage point reveals aspects of truth invisible from other angles, whilst the process of articulating ideas to others forces clarity and precision that solitary reflection rarely achieves. The permanence of such collective wisdom connects to Spinoza's profound insight that the human mind cannot be absolutely destroyed with the body, but something of it remains, which is eternal. Ideas developed through rational dialogue become part of humanity's permanent heritage, contributing to an accumulating treasury of understanding that transcends individual mortality. When minds meet in genuine pursuit of truth, they create something larger than themselves, something that persists even as particular individuals pass away. This eternal dimension of human thought emerges not through mystical transcendence, but through the very natural process by which rational insights, once discovered, become available to future generations. Authentic intellectual community requires more than polite agreement or competitive debate. It demands people willing to challenge and refine each other's ideas through respectful disagreement and collaborative investigation. This means questioning assumptions, exposing hidden contradictions, and pushing beyond comfortable conclusions. Such engagement requires both intellectual courage and emotional maturity. The capacity to separate one's ideas from one's identity, allowing cherished beliefs to be examined and potentially transformed through encounter with other perspectives. This vision of collective reason forms the foundation for Spinoza's conception of an ideal political community, what we might call a republic of minds. Here, collective decisions emerge not from mere aggregation of individual preferences, nor from submission to traditional authority, nor from manipulation through fear and propaganda, but from rational deliberation among citizens capable of genuine democratic participation. Such deliberation requires people who can distinguish between their immediate desires and their long-term interests, between local concerns and universal principles, between what feels comfortable and what promotes genuine, human flourishing. Spinoza articulated this political vision with characteristic clarity. The end of the state is not to dominate men, nor to restrain them by fear. Rather, it is so to free each man from fear that he may live and act with full security. This creates conditions where reason can operate freely, where people can engage in the kind of open inquiry that collective wisdom requires. Fear narrows perspective, makes people defensive about their existing beliefs, and reduces political participation to mere self-protection. Security, by contrast, enables the intellectual generosity necessary for genuine dialogue and the emotional stability required for changing one's mind when presented with better reasons. Cultural diversity enriches this collective wisdom by revealing different ways of organizing social life and approaching perennial human challenges. Rather than threatening social unity, such diversity becomes essential to comprehensive understanding. Different cultures develop distinct insights into human nature, innovative solutions to practical problems, and varied expressions of universal values like justice, beauty, and truth. When approached with curiosity rather than defensiveness, cultural exchange becomes a source of learning that expands everyone's understanding of human possibilities. This perspective transforms tolerance from grudging acceptance of difference into active appreciation of diversity's contribution to collective wisdom. Part 11. Spinoza's understanding of eternity represents one of philosophy's most radical departures from conventional thinking about time and permanence. When we speak of something lasting forever, we imagine endless temporal duration stretching infinitely into the future. Spinoza shatters this conception entirely. Eternity, for him, is not lasting forever in time, but the logical structure that makes temporal sequence possible in the first place. This distinction transforms everything. Consider mathematical truths like the Pythagorean theorem. This relationship between the sides of a right triangle doesn't exist in time, waiting to be discovered or gradually wearing away through the centuries. Rather, it provides the eternal framework within which temporal measurements and calculations unfold. When an ancient Greek geometer and a modern engineer both apply this theorem, they're accessing the same eternal truth, not encountering different temporal instances of it. The theorem is eternal not because it lasts a long time, but because it expresses relationships that are timelessly true whenever they are instantiated in temporal measurements. Spinoza captures this precisely. Eternity cannot be explained in terms of time or have any relation to time. Eternity is the aspect of reality that remains constant, whilst temporal events change according to eternal laws and patterns. Physical laws operate eternally even though particular instances of their operation occur in temporal sequence. Gravity doesn't age or evolve. It provides the eternal structural principle within which temporal gravitational interactions play out across cosmic history. This creates a revolutionary experiential possibility. From the eternal perspective, all moments of time are equally real and present, like all points on a geometric figure are simultaneously present to mathematical understanding rather than being encountered sequentially. When we grasp a geometric proof, we don't work through it temporally, step by step, and then lose the earlier steps. Instead, the entire logical structure becomes simultaneously present to our understanding. The eternal perspective doesn't eliminate temporal experience, but provides a broader context for understanding it. Human beings exist both in time and in eternity, and recognizing this dual nature unlocks profound practical wisdom. We are finite biological organisms with temporal duration from birth to death, subject to aging, change, and mortality. Yet, we are also expressions of eternal logical relationships that define our essential nature as rational, creative, social beings. Our capacity for mathematical and logical understanding demonstrates our participation in eternity. When we grasp eternal truths, we temporarily transcend temporal limitations without leaving temporal existence. Spinoza reveals the transformative implications. The mind can be of such a nature that the part of it which we have shown to perish with the body should be of little importance in comparison with the part which survives. This isn't mystical speculation but practical psychology. The more we develop our capacity for eternal understanding, the less we identify exclusively with our temporal, mortal aspects. We remain fully embodied temporal beings whilst simultaneously participating in eternal patterns of truth and relationship. This dual recognition creates a form of practical wisdom that neither clings desperately to temporal existence nor seeks to escape it through false transcendence. We can fully accept our temporal limitations and mortality whilst recognizing our participation in something eternal. This isn't consolation philosophy but accurate self-understanding. When we understand ourselves as temporal expressions of eternal principles, both our suffering and our joy find their proper context within the broader patterns that govern all existence. Understanding this prepares us for the most practical application of Spinoza's metaphysics, learning to see our lives sub specie aeternitatis, from the perspective of eternity, which transforms our relationship to every temporal challenge and opportunity. Spinoza's most transformative insight involves learning to see things under the aspect of eternity, sub specie aeternitatis. This means understanding events not as contingent happenings that might have been otherwise, but as necessary expressions of eternal laws. Your personal failures, society's conflicts, natural disasters, individual successes, all become comprehensible as natural phenomena following discoverable patterns rather than arbitrary occurrences in a chaotic universe. Insofar as the mind conceives a thing under the aspect of eternity, Spinoza writes, it is not through conceiving the thing's present actual existence, but through conceiving the thing's essence insofar as it involves existence. This means grasping the essential nature that makes something what it is, rather than focusing on its particular temporal manifestations. When you understand your anger as a natural response to perceived threats rather than as moral failing, when you see economic inequality as predictable outcome of certain social arrangements rather than mysterious injustice, you begin thinking sub specie aeternitatis. This perspective transforms your relationship to both suffering and joy. Suffering becomes more bearable when understood as natural and temporary, rather than cosmic injustice or personal failure. The grief following loss, the anxiety before uncertainty, the frustration with limitation, these emerge as natural expressions of finite beings, encountering the boundaries of their power. Yet this understanding doesn't diminish their reality or importance. It provides context that prevents overwhelming despair. Similarly, joy becomes deeper when recognized as participation in eternal creative processes rather than mere personal satisfaction. The delight in learning, the pleasure of friendship, the satisfaction of meaningful work, these connect you to the universe's fundamental creative intelligence, expressing itself through human consciousness. Your happiness becomes less fragile because it's grounded in something larger than circumstance. Consider illness viewed sub specie aeternitatis. Rather than punishment or cosmic mistake, disease becomes natural process. Cells following biological laws, immune systems responding according to their capacities, treatments working through discoverable mechanisms. This perspective makes it easier to respond skillfully to medical treatment whilst accepting outcomes beyond control. The eternal view doesn't eliminate concern for health but prevents the additional suffering of taking illness personally. The eternal perspective doesn't eliminate temporal concerns but provides broader context, preventing you from being overwhelmed by immediate circumstances or losing sight of what genuinely matters long-term. This creates what Spinoza calls acquiescence, acceptance of what cannot be changed, combined with active engagement with what can be influenced. The free man, who lives only according to the guidance of reason, he observes, is not led by fear of death, but directly desires the good. Eternal perspective makes temporal action more, rather than less effective, by eliminating anxiety and desperation that lead to poor judgment. When you're not desperately attached to specific outcomes, you can assess situations more clearly, choose strategies more wisely, persist through setbacks more steadily. The parent who understands adolescent rebellion as natural developmental process responds more skillfully than one who takes it as personal attack. Wisdom involves learning to move fluidly between temporal engagement, caring about particular outcomes, and working skillfully to achieve beneficial results, and eternal detachment, accepting whatever outcomes actually occur as expressions of natural necessity. This creates practical equanimity that neither avoids temporal responsibilities nor becomes obsessed with controlling outcomes beyond influence. This philosophical practice opens into something profound: direct participatory knowing of your place in the eternal creative intelligence, expressing itself through all natural processes, including human consciousness and community. Spinoza reveals something extraordinary about the deepest moments of human understanding. When we achieve genuine rational insight into nature's workings, something profound occurs that transcends mere theoretical knowledge. In those moments of crystalline clarity, whether grasping a mathematical proof, understanding a scientific principle, or achieving philosophical insight, we experience ourselves not as separate observers studying an external world, but as temporary expressions of the same infinite intellect that governs all natural processes. This is mystical experience in its most authentic form, yet it requires no supernatural intervention or special revelation. When a mathematician suddenly grasps the elegant necessity of a geometric proof, when a scientist understands the underlying unity connecting seemingly disparate phenomena, when an artist creates from a place of deep inspiration, the ordinary sense of separation between thinker and thought temporarily dissolves. We discover that our understanding is not merely our own private achievement, but nature becoming conscious of itself through human minds. Spinoza captures this with breathtaking precision. The intellectual love of the mind towards God is that very love of God whereby God loves himself. This means our highest understanding is literally God or nature achieving self-consciousness through human intelligence. We are not external observers of reality, but reality observing itself through us. The infinite creative intelligence that expresses itself through cosmic processes, biological evolution, and natural laws achieves conscious reflection through human understanding, creativity, and love. This transforms mystical experience from escape into deeper engagement. Traditional mysticism often seeks transcendence of natural existence, viewing material reality as obstacle or illusion. Spinoza's mysticism involves profound immersion in natural reality through understanding its rational structure. We don't transcend nature but recognize ourselves as nature's own self-awareness, making mystical experience accessible through disciplined thinking rather than requiring supernatural grace. Scientific understanding becomes mystical when we grasp our participation in the same rational principles governing cosmic processes. We are temporary expressions of universal intelligence, brief moments when the infinite creativity organizing galaxies and atoms becomes conscious of its own activity. This creates what Spinoza calls blessedness, stable joy based on understanding rather than external circumstances. As he puts it, blessedness is not the reward of virtue, but virtue itself. This mystical dimension represents the experiential culmination of intellectual love of God or nature. Not mere theoretical knowledge, but lived participation in infinite creative intelligence, expressing itself through natural processes, human consciousness, creativity, and community. Through systematic philosophical practice and ethical development, anyone can potentially achieve this form of salvation that is both completely natural and genuinely transcendent. Transcendent not of nature, but of narrow self-concern through understanding our place in nature's infinite creativity. This philosophical and mystical integration now demands practical translation into daily existence, providing concrete guidance for living wisely and joyfully as natural beings who have discovered their eternal participation in reality's deepest patterns. Part 12. The Spinozist Life. The path toward freedom begins with a simple but revolutionary practice, examining the natural causes of our emotions and desires. Rather than accepting our feelings as mysterious forces that overwhelm us, Spinoza invites us to become investigators of our own psychological patterns. When anger flares or anxiety grips us, we pause to ask, what triggered this response? What beliefs or assumptions underlie my reaction? What would a clearer understanding of this situation reveal? This daily practice of emotional analysis transforms our relationship to our inner life. Spinoza observed that an emotion, which is a passion, ceases to be a passion as soon as we form a clear and distinct idea of it. The very act of understanding why we feel what we feel begins to dissolve the compulsive power of that emotion. We discover that most of our automatic reactions stem from inadequate ideas about ourselves, others, or our circumstances. The colleague who irritates us may trigger memories of childhood powerlessness. The fear that paralyzes us often rests on imagined scenarios rather than present realities. Through systematic reflection, we gradually map the hidden patterns that usually operate below conscious awareness. We notice how certain thoughts predictably generate anxiety, how specific situations reliably trigger defensive reactions, how particular beliefs about ourselves create unnecessary suffering. This knowledge becomes our liberation. We cannot eliminate emotions, nor would we want to, but we can transform our relationship to them, from passive victimhood to active understanding. The practice extends beyond crisis moments into the cultivation of what Spinoza calls active affects, emotions that flow from our own nature rather than being imposed by external events. We develop genuine curiosity about natural phenomena, human behavior, artistic expression, or any domain of knowledge that engages our interest. The joy of discovery, the satisfaction of creative work, the peace of understanding provide renewable sources of happiness that don't depend on favorable circumstances or social approval. These interests become refuges of stability in an uncertain world. When external conditions disappoint us, when relationships fail, when plans collapse, we retain access to the inexhaustible pleasure of learning and creating. The botanist finds wonder in plant structures regardless of personal troubles. The musician discovers harmony even in difficult times. The philosopher pursues understanding whether fortune smiles or frowns. These pursuits generate what Spinoza recognizes as the most reliable form of human satisfaction. Yet we remain fundamentally interconnected beings. And wisdom involves embracing, rather than resenting, this interdependence. The practice of gratitude systematically attends to usually invisible conditions that make our existence possible. the biological processes maintaining our health, the social institutions providing security and opportunity, the natural systems sustaining all life, the cultural heritage providing language and knowledge. Spinoza reminds us that no one can live happily who is entirely isolated. Gratitude transforms our awareness of dependence from a source of anxiety into a wellspring of appreciation. We realize that every breath depends on atmospheric conditions, every meal on agricultural systems, every thought on educational traditions, every moment of safety on social cooperation. This recognition generates humility without helplessness, connection without loss of individuality. The physical dimension of our existence demands equal attention. Spinoza's understanding of mind-body unity means that caring for physical health directly enhances mental capacities, whilst neglecting bodily needs undermines rational functioning. Appropriate exercise, nutrition, and rest honor our nature as embodied rational beings, rather than treating the body as an obstacle to spiritual development. These practices work together to create what we might call psychological resilience, but the flexible capacity to respond thoughtfully rather than reactively to life's inevitable challenges. Through emotional analysis, we understand our patterns. Through active interests, we maintain sources of joy independent of circumstances. Spinoza's naturalistic understanding of human behavior transforms how we approach the inevitable conflicts and losses that mark every human life. When someone harms us through deception, cruelty, or betrayal, our immediate response typically involves anger, resentment, and a desire for retaliation. Yet, Spinoza invites us to examine the natural causes behind such behavior: ignorance about what truly serves human flourishing, fear driving desperate self-protection, past conditioning that shaped destructive patterns, or social pressures that reward harmful competition over genuine cooperation. Understanding these causes doesn't excuse harmful behavior or require us to accept mistreatment passively. Rather, it allows us to respond from comprehension rather than reactive emotion, which typically proves more effective in actually resolving conflicts and protecting ourselves from future harm. Spinoza observes that hatred is increased by being reciprocated and can, on the other hand, be destroyed by love. This isn't sentimental advice but practical psychology. Responding to hostility with understanding often breaks cycles of escalating conflict that consume enormous energy while solving nothing. Consider how differently we handle conflicts when we recognize that most people act harmfully, not from malicious intent but from confused ideas about what promotes their well-being. Someone who lies compulsively may have learned early that truth brings punishment. Someone who manipulates others may genuinely believe that direct honesty leads to rejection and isolation. Someone who responds to criticism with rage may carry deep wounds around shame and inadequacy. Seeing these patterns doesn't require us to tolerate destructive behavior, but it suggests more intelligent responses than simple retaliation. This same naturalistic perspective transforms our relationship with loss and disappointment. Every finite existence involves losing what we cherish. Relationships end, opportunities vanish, health declines, loved ones die. Fighting against these inevitable limitations creates what Spinoza calls fluctuations of mind, exhausting emotional turbulence that adds unnecessary suffering to natural pain whilst accomplishing nothing constructive. Accepting loss as natural rather than tragic allows us to appreciate what we possess whilst we possess it, without the desperate clinging that often destroys the very things we seek to preserve. Spinoza notes that the free man thinks least of all of death, and his wisdom is a meditation not on death, but on life. This doesn't mean ignoring mortality, but rather focusing our limited energy on creative engagement with present possibilities instead of anxious preoccupation with future losses. Disappointment becomes particularly instructive when we examine what exactly disappoints us. Often, our distress reflects unrealistic expectations about what others can provide, confused beliefs about what we need for happiness, or attachment to outcomes that depend on factors beyond our control. A romantic relationship that ends may teach us about the difference between genuine intimacy and possessive attachment. A career setback may reveal how much of our self-worth depends on external validation rather than authentic accomplishment. A financial loss may clarify which comforts we genuinely need and which merely serve our ego or social image. Many conflicts arise from competing inadequate ideas about what promotes human flourishing. Two parents might fight intensely over their child's education, both believing they want what's best, yet operating from different assumptions about what children need to thrive. Political disagreements often reflect deeper confusion about human nature and social organization, rather than simple differences in values. When people are willing to examine their assumptions and consider alternative approaches, rational dialogue frequently proves more effective than force or manipulation in resolving such disputes. This requires distinguishing between conflicts over genuine interests, which may need negotiation or compromise, and conflicts over confused ideas, which may dissolve through better understanding. If two neighbors both need quiet to work but one practices music loudly, they face a practical problem requiring creative solutions. The Spinozist life extends far beyond individual rational development. Spinoza understood that human flourishing is fundamentally social, rooted in his revolutionary insight that nothing is more useful to man than man, but only when people are developing their distinctively human capacities for reason, creativity, and ethical relationship. This transforms social engagement from altruistic sacrifice into rational self-interest, because we benefit immensely from living in communities where education, arts, sciences, and ethical development are valued and supported. Creating conditions for human flourishing becomes a natural extension of understanding our own nature. When we grasp that our highest capacities emerge through interaction with other rational, creative beings, we recognize that surrounding ourselves with ignorance, fear, and desperation diminishes our own possibilities for meaningful existence. The person living according to reason naturally seeks to create social and cultural conditions that enable others to develop their rational and creative capacities, not from abstract moral duty, but because such communities enhance everyone's potential for satisfying work, meaningful relationships, and intellectual growth. This involves supporting education that encourages critical thinking rather than mere conformity, arts that express genuine human creativity rather than commercial manipulation, sciences that pursue understanding rather than technological control, and political institutions that promote authentic human development rather than social control that prevents people from discovering their authentic capacities. Spinoza recognized that the object of government is not to change men from rational beings into beasts or puppets, but to enable them to develop their minds and bodies in security. Rational people naturally want to live in societies that encourage these conditions, because they create the social environment in which individual excellence can flourish. Environmental care flows naturally from this understanding. When we recognize ourselves as expressions of nature rather than separate from it, harming the natural systems that sustain life becomes a form of harming ourselves and future generations. This makes ecological responsibility a form of rational self-interest rather than external moral obligation. Spinoza's identification of God with nature transforms reverence for natural processes into religious devotion that expresses itself through scientific understanding and practical care for the conditions supporting all life. This creates environmental ethics based on understanding our place in natural systems rather than abstract duties or sentimental attachment to particular species or landscapes. The goal is not personal perfection or individual salvation, but contributing to the ongoing creative evolution of human consciousness and social organization in ways that honor both individual uniqueness and collective interdependence. This makes the Spinozist life inherently social and political, whilst remaining grounded in individual rational development and authentic self-expression. We participate in something larger than ourselves, not by transcending our nature, but by fully realizing it within communities that support the flourishing of all their members. Human beings achieve their highest possibilities not in isolation, but through creating conditions where everyone can develop their distinctive capacities for understanding, creativity, and ethical relationship. This vision synthesizes individual excellence with social responsibility, making the cultivation of human potential both a personal practice and a collective project that honors the creative power of nature. Part 13. Spinoza's revolutionary insight that God and nature are identical provides the foundation for a complete philosophical system that eliminates the traditional oppositions between reason and faith, mind and body, individual and community, freedom and necessity that have plagued Western thought since antiquity. Through Deus sive natura, these apparent contradictions dissolve as different aspects of one reality, rather than competing alternatives requiring us to choose sides. This unified vision allows us to be simultaneously rational and spiritual, individual and social, free and natural, without internal contradiction or the need to suppress any aspect of our humanity in favor of others. The traditional Western mind has tortured itself with false dilemmas, either reason or faith, either individual autonomy or social belonging, either natural necessity or genuine freedom. Spinoza shows these as pseudo-problems created by inadequate ideas about reality's fundamental structure. When we understand that the rational order of nature and the divine creative power are the same thing seen from different perspectives, we need not choose between scientific understanding and spiritual experience. When we grasp that individual development and social cooperation both express the same underlying drive toward greater perfection and power, we need not sacrifice personal authenticity for communal harmony. His naturalistic psychology demonstrates how understanding the causes of our emotions and desires liberates us from compulsive patterns whilst cultivating more rational and satisfying ways of living. This makes philosophy genuinely therapeutic rather than merely academic. The analysis of Conatus, the emotions, and the path from bondage to freedom provides practical guidance for psychological development that is both scientifically grounded and spiritually fulfilling. As Spinoza writes, the free man, who lives only according to the guidance of reason, is not led by fear of death, but directly desires the good. This creates mental health that integrates understanding with emotional well-being rather than treating them as separate domains. Traditional approaches to psychology either reduce human experience to mechanical processes or appeal to mysterious forces beyond natural explanation. Spinoza's approach recognizes the full complexity of human emotional life, whilst showing how it operates according to comprehensible principles. We need not choose between acknowledging our passionate nature and developing rational self-direction. Understanding how our affects arise and interact allows us to work with our emotional constitution rather than against it, and creative expression as natural outcomes of clearer thinking and more adequate ideas about our situation. The ethics of joy that emerges from this system affirms human life and creativity, whilst providing rational guidance for individual flourishing and social cooperation based on our actual nature rather than impossible ideals or external commands that conflict with human psychology. Virtue as power, the cultivation of active effects, and the community of reason create a comprehensive approach to ethical life that enhances, rather than suppresses, natural human capacities. This makes morality an expression of health and wisdom rather than a burden imposed on reluctant nature, creating sustainable motivation for ethical behavior based on understanding rather than fear or guilt. Most ethical systems demand that we transcend or overcome our natural inclinations through willpower, duty, or divine grace. Spinoza shows how genuine virtue emerges from the full development of our natural powers of thinking, feeling, and acting. The person who understands their place in nature's creative process naturally acts in ways that promote both personal flourishing and collective well-being, not because external rules demand it, but because such actions express their deepest nature as rational, social beings. Spinoza's vision of blessedness through intellectual love of God or nature offers spiritual fulfillment, requiring no supernatural beliefs, whilst connecting us to something genuinely infinite and eternal. The rational creative power expressing itself through all natural processes